Good evening and welcome to the March 6th Committee of the Whole meeting. I welcome the public that are joining us in the council chambers tonight, as well as those that are online with us, and any of those that may join us for a future view of this program. I'd also like to welcome our staff that are in council chambers tonight and also online, and my colleagues from the left, Councillor Novak and Councillor O'Keefe, Councillor Rentoul, and to my right, Mayor McNeil Smith, Councillor Duncan, and Councillor Garnett. So, and myself, I'm Councillor Duck, your chair for the meeting tonight. And I'd like to also acknowledge our territory. We acknowledge with gratitude we live, work, and learn on the traditional territories of the Wasanic people, who have been and continue to be the stewards caring for this land and all on it for time immemorial. We welcome opportunities of how we can live better together. Thank you. Haishka. I would like to call for the approval of the agenda as presented. Moved by Councillor O'Keefe, seconded by Councillor Duncan. All in favor? Do we have a problem with microphones? No. Try. Oh, both buttons. Sorry. My mistake. Quick learner. All right, so we've had approval for the agenda and everybody was in favor, yes? Okay. Moving to the first item, public participation. I invite the public to come up to the microphone and please provide your name and municipality in which you reside. And you have approximately 3 minutes to share your thoughts on any of the items on the agenda tonight. Are there any members of the public who would like to speak tonight? Come forward, please, sir, and press the button on the bottom there to make the microphone live.
Hello, my name is Ivo Van Basteler. I'm a resident of Sydney, have been for over 20 years. I'm a retired professional engineer, and I've been working in this area as well as many other areas of the Capital Regional District. As a matter of fact, all areas of the Capital Regional District. My specialty is environmental and civil engineering, particularly in the area of municipal design, construction. I would like to speak to this aspect of the transportation study, which has to deal with the parking, and particularly the need to implement the paid parking at this point in time. I see in one section of the study that this is a pilot program that's proposed for the downtown area. And may I suggest that once we implement a pilot study, there's no turning back. And my question is it needed at all at this point in time to look at? I noticed too that on one of the aspects of this, on page 20 particularly of the report, one of the guiding principles here, or the policies, was to support an increase in the non-automobile transportation. And again, I have a bit of a challenge with this in terms of the study, because I believe it has not been respective of the demographics of this area. Later on in this study, we see that the majority of the people in Sydney, this is are in the age category of 75 to 84. The second most populous area is in the age category of 65 to 74. So the aspect that I'm pointing out here is that these people aren't riding bicycles. These people are accessing the downtown core either by walking or by vehicle, in which case they need parking. It's also, they need parking close to where they're going to be, and they are not necessarily going to be there for an extended length of time. Basically, they're in to get something and to get back out. The data that I see in the report seems to be a little bit skewed in my estimation, because it's based on an assumption which is shown on page 25 of the report. That's all observed vehicles to be parked for a minimum of 1 hour. So they've already assumed that the parking has been 1 hour based on license plates. Now, I would suggest that many of those license plates were BC based, but were not there for that full 1 hour. There is a lot of seasonal variation, by the way, and I don't really believe that a study that's looking at population or usage in August, September is going to be substantially different than what we see in early October. So I would think that the consultant should have perhaps looked at something in the middle of winter if he really wanted some seasonal observation. I also note that he did identify that there wasn't a lot of difference really between the 2016 study and the 2022 study. When I look at the statistics on this, it looks like the difference is between 72% and 76%. So it's really not a lot of variation. And the other thing that I noted in here is that he kept stressing that we were not meeting the 85% target already where we're at. So once again, I draw back to my original question, is a pilot study of paid parking really necessary in Sydney? What I see the council doing is pushing us toward a Victoria model, and I would suggest that most people come to Sydney who are exterior residents or outside of Sydney come to Sydney because they don't want to go to Sydney, to Victoria. The bike lanes, the difficulty in parking, everything else that we see down there, which has been created by our Mayor Helps, is really turning people away from going down to Victoria. I've been in Victoria. I used to work in Victoria, and it was much nicer going downtown when we didn't have to fight bike lanes all over the place. And I suggest that many of the people are suffering down there because of the bike lanes, which are not used. I'd like to stress that parking is really needed. If people cannot park on Beacon Avenue during the peak hours, they will naturally go to the side streets. You don't have to force them off by paid parking. At this point in time, I would suggest that by implementing even a pilot program at this time would be a step in the wrong direction. That's about all. I've reviewed the study quite a bit. I will follow up my comments with a letter to Mayor and Council, so you can look forward to seeing that. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any others that wish to speak? Yes, please come forward.
Just press it once.
It's already on.
That's already on. Okay. Hi there. My name is Gwen Davey. I'm a resident of Ardwell Avenue in Sydney. I've read the Watt proposal. That's the one that was attached to this council meeting. And I, like my colleague over here, have several questions about the accuracy of the survey itself. I'd be very curious to know how much these surveys cost, because I blew so many holes in it, I don't think you're getting value for money. So the first thing I'd like to address was the amount of people that were spoken to regarding this survey. There was 156 people that took this survey. That represents 1.2% of the population of Sydney. Now, some of the recommendations in this survey, like my colleague was speaking about, the kiosks, I counted the amount of blocks on Beacon Avenue, and there is 9 blocks where they could be proposed to put these kiosks, parking kiosks. And the parking kiosks are valued at anywhere from $7,000 to $15,000. So that's going at a low ball from about from 63,000 to 135,000. I just don't think a small town like Sydney needs that. Now, of the people that took this survey, 65% of them drove. That's 101 people out of 156 drove. 27% walked. That means 42 people that took this survey walked to Sydney. 5% took a bike. That's 7.8 people. Let's round it up to 8. 8 people over 4 days that took a survey used a bicycle. Now, I have a lot of misgivings about all these proposed bike lanes because, as my colleague said, the average age in Sydney is from 74 to 85. The next age is from 65 up. The age group from 0 up to 65 is virtually stagnant. They expect no growth over the next 10 years in that age group, yet we seem to be catering to a lot of people who want these bike lanes. Now, don't get me wrong, I like bikes. I got a bike. I just don't think Sydney is a big enough town to put in the amount of bike lanes and lose the amount of parking that they are projecting. Now, of this survey, the satisfaction survey was done, and 65% are satisfied with the parking in Sydney. I'd say that's pretty darn good. Okay, just a second here, number 4. As my colleague also pointed out, we did not meet the 85% point in any point across the 4 days. Now, I just question how the data is being used, because I myself go into Sydney frequently with my car. If I go in for over an hour, I always park on a side street, because I'm feeling that I'm giving another person a chance to park on Beacon Avenue, where it's easier, more easily accessible. So anybody who parks for under an hour, the data is not used. It says that we did not achieve the 85% threshold to warrant that the parking be changed. But in the next bit, they say that they are interested in this pilot project to put kiosks, and I agree with my colleague. Once this thing stops, they don't go back, and I'm firmly against paying $135,000, $63,000 to $135,000 for a pilot project for kiosks. We can't afford it. We're just a little town. My next, the next thing I'd like to address is, it says in this report that the primary purpose of paid parking is to manage parking demand, not to generate revenue. If you got a 65% satisfaction rate, things seem to be going okay. I don't see that we have to facilitate paid parking if revenue is not the key. People generally seem to be pretty happy with things. Another thing that I have an issue with, it's page 87 of the report, and it talks about real-time displays. Now, when I drive around Sydney, I can look into any of the parking lots, and I can usually do, once around the parking lot, I got a pretty good idea whether I'm going to get a spot. We don't have to have a real-time display. We're not Victoria. We don't need to have a real-time display to show how many available spaces are in that lot. This particular one, I know it's just a photograph, and they're just using it as an example, but this one is in Burlington, Ontario. Burlington has a population of 209,000 people. We're 5% of that. We're just a teeny little place. You know, don't spend money where it's not needed. If you had a big parkade and you couldn't see at a glance what parking spots were available, it might be something to look at. But I can go into any parking spot in Sydney and get a pretty good idea of what's there and what's not there. Just 1 second. And bike parking. Bicycles and bike parking is a red-hot issue in Sydney, especially with the possibility of losing parking spaces along Bevan Avenue. One of the things that was mentioned in this survey was bike storage cubes. Now, they showed a picture of them in Toronto. They gotta be the ugliest things I have ever seen. We don't want that in Sydney. Unless you're gonna put it in somebody's own private parking lot, that's all right. But you know, the first thing that's gonna happen is it's gonna get covered in graffiti. We don't need that. And I would urge the council maybe to float an idea out to employers. If they want to encourage people to ride their bicycles to work, make a place at the place of work where they can park the bicycles. Allow them to take them into the offices, allow them to take them into the backs of the stores. Then these people would be more inclined, because they know their bikes aren't going to get stolen. And that would also free up spots for people, for buyers to go onto the street and park. If you want to go and park, If you want to go and buy something and there's no place to park, you're just going to split. And a lot of parking is tied up with residents that work in Sydney that really can't take their bike because they're worried about it getting ripped off. So I think the employers should maybe be tipped and step up and start offering their employees some sort of parking for their bicycles. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any others who wish to speak to committee tonight? Please come forward. Just turn on the microphone first. Thank you.
There we go. Hello. Eric Diller here of Rest Haven Drive, across from Rest Haven Park, one of the study areas for tonight's presentation. I'll, of course, have a slightly differing view to the last two speakers. I'm speaking here to also regarding the excellent staff report by Ms. Clary and staff, which accompanies the Watt Consultants Parking Study. And I want to applaud the town staff for acknowledging that the fact that pricing parking is one of the solutions to not only the town's perceived parking issues, but also to the budgetary issue of car parking subsidization. And although we won't be covering this tonight, some of our housing issues that we're facing in Sydney, which are quite dire. So I'm speaking in support of price parking because I feel that pricing is the best way to manage the perceived shortage of parking. I agree with many of the findings in the Watt report, and will add that I've never had a problem finding a parking spot when I drive and park in Sydney, which I occasionally do. And I'll add that I have also never been asked to pay for this extremely valuable resource that the town is providing to us at no cost. So great. We've acknowledged that there's a perceived lack of parking supply, and we're here tonight to consider whether there will be price parking, and again, I'm in support of this. Now, if the town moves forward with pricing parking, there are a few potential problems that the town could face when pricing the parking. I will at this point say that the town is not alone in grappling with this issue. Many, many cities across North America are undergoing changes to their parking policies, and I would encourage the town to look up the Parking Reform Network and deeply consider creating a local government legislation that allows parking benefit districts to occur. The Parking Reform Network has a great paper called The Activist Guide to Parking Benefit Districts. It's an excellent document that the town should really consider using. Yeah, I'm just going to back up and just maybe address some of the issues that some of the other speakers have raised. So they claim that 65% are in favor of this. Well, that obviously means that 35% are not in favor of that. And that they do see problems with our parking management, which I would tend to agree with. There is a problem with management. And the other thing is that if these people were to have read our OCP, they would see reams and reams and reams of paragraphs stating that the direction that we want to take our town is to a more walkable, more cyclable, more public transit friendly town, which I completely agree with. I've got 2 small kids. I've got elderly parents that live here in Sydney, and I would just love for them to be able to get around. And so I'm just going to close out just by saying kudos, great work, let's do this, because we're just going to make the town a better place. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm Murray Weisenberger, and I live here in Sydney. I'm just going to say that, am I correct that there is likely to be another opportunity to speak to all of these, as I thought I read in the report that I read, is that likely to be a committee of the whole that will give us an extensive opportunity to speak to this? And just want to say that I support the general gist of the report. I look forward to going forward, and we'll speak at length to it at the next opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll call for a third time if there are any people in the audience who would like to speak. And on that note, I will close public participation period And we'll move on to item 5 on the agenda, and I will seek my colleagues for an approval of the minutes of the regular Committee of the Whole meeting, February 21st, 2023.
Move the minutes be approved.
And seconded?
Second.
Okay, moved by Councillor Rentoul, second by Councillor Novak. Any additions, changes, or deletions to the minutes? Seeing none, all in favor? The motion is passed. Now move on to presentations, and we have on the agenda tonight, we have the 2022 downtown parking study. In chambers tonight, we have Tim Shaw from the Watt Consulting Group, and online he's joined by his colleague Philippos Gekas, and they will present the parking study. On that note, normally we allow 10 minutes for presentation of these presentations, and I'd seek a motion, Councillor or Mayor Smith.
Thank you, Chair. I'd move that we extend extend the presentation time.
Second.
Second.
Moved by Mayor Neil Smith, seconded by Councillor Garnett. Any discussion? All in favor? Motion is carried. Welcome, Mr. Shaw, and we look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll make sure I've got the clicker. Let's try this again. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Good evening, Chair and Council. Really happy to be here and talk to you about the 2022 Sydney downtown parking study that we conducted. It should be about a 25, 30-minute presentation or so. I'll try and be as brief as I can, but I want to make sure I provide all the right details. So, like I said, thanks for the introduction. My name is Tim Shaw. I am a senior transportation planner with Watt Consulting Group. I led the project. I'm also joined by my colleague Philippos Gekas, who's on Zoom here, who did a lot of the heavy lifting as well. So kudos and shout out to him. And also Matthew Lilly, who is our data collection lead, who oversaw the data collection process. So as far as the agenda for the presentation, start off with just an overview of the project, and then do a deep dive into the existing parking conditions, so looking at the data. We'll talk about the intercept survey and what that was intended to do, and then we'll get into the recommendations that we came up with in the study. So really, what was this project about? Really kind of coming down to 3 objectives. Understand what changed since the 2016 parking study was conducted, especially in the high demand areas. Determine what the most suitable parking management tools are to address both current and emerging parking challenges. And then determine if the town requires additional parking capacity, such as a structured parking facility. I do want to be really clear, this was a technical parking study, really looking at the data and how the data could sort of drive the recommendations that we came up with. So this is the study area. Apologies if you can't see it too well, but essentially it's sort of the commercial core of Sydney, plus the residential areas to the north of James White Boulevard, and also south of Ocean. And Resthaven Drive was also included, part of Resthaven Drive was included as part of the study area based on the scope of the project and based on instruction from town staff. So what's happened since 2016? So again, apologies if you can't see this in detail, but we just wanted to show, the 2016 study had a number of recommendations, including, considering a surface parking lot adjacent to Mary Winsper. Of course, that lot was created, serving as a downtown employee public parking lot. Modifying parking restrictions between Beacon Avenue and Bevan Avenue from 2 hours to 1 hour. That was also done. The time limit changed from 2 hours to 1 hour just on Beacon Avenue. And that was a recommendation from the 2016 study. And there's a whole bunch of others here on the screen, but really just to sort of show kind of like a status or report card of what's actually been done since the 2016 study. And as you can see, the town has acted on a number of the recommendations, which I think are improving parking management, but there's still opportunities for more improvement, of course. So now moving to the existing parking conditions. So numbers are the slides here are fairly numbers are pretty dense with the data and the numbers. So apologies, I'm going to go through this fairly quickly though, but happy to again to answer any questions in the Q&A. So essentially, what the slide here is showing you is just the overview of the parking that was included in this study. So on-street parking, there are just over 1,000 parking spaces in the study area. You can see most, about 50%, are signed as 2-hour parking. And then with the next about 40% or so as no restriction. And then there's a range of other restrictions there, as you can see. For the off-street parking, so this is just town-owned, so just public parking, just to be clear, no private parking, that was not included in the study. So just town-owned, so those are mostly the lots, the off-street parking lots. 44% are signed or have the restriction of all-day parking. And then 33% as 3-hour parking. And then there's a mix of other restrictions in there as well. This map here is just showing this is from the town's website, just showing downtown parking and the restrictions. Really the point of the slide is just to show that there's a lot of restrictions that the town has when it comes to parking. We think too many, and we have some suggestions on how to simplify that and consolidate some of the restrictions. And I'll speak to that later in the presentation. So parking utilization by count day. So parking utilization is one of the metrics or one of the ways to measure overall parking conditions. It basically provides an indication of how many of the parking spaces are occupied. So we did four counts as part of this parking study. These are all-day counts, Wednesday, August 31st, Saturday, September 3rd, Saturday, October 1st, and Wednesday, October 5th. 4 counts in the study area to look at overall parking conditions. So what you see in this slide here is that pretty consistently across the board, 1 o'clock was the busiest or the peak hour, with Wednesday, October 5th being the busiest at about 76%. And that's sort of the average right across the study area, just to be clear. But 1 o'clock was the busiest time. So this slide here is just kind of showing parking utilization from a different perspective. You can see in the graph there, it's the 4 count days, but more importantly, there's the red dashed line, which you'll see a lot in my slides, in the next few slides here. That is the target of 85% utilization target that's been mentioned already. And really what that means, you can see there's also a little graphic there, just to kind of put that in perspective. What we mean by the 85% utilization is that typically in a lot of communities and in the parking management industry as best practice, you want to be sort of in the 75 to 85% utilization area. What that means is, well, people are actually coming to your downtown, they're shopping, they're spending money, they're using the available parking spaces, but it means that we're not over, because usually when you're over 85%, that means there's essentially not enough parking available, demand is exceeding supply, and you have things like people cruising for parking or circling the block for parking, which exacerbates traffic congestion, climate change, air pollution, so on and so forth. So being in that sweet spot of 75 to 85% means that usually there's about 2 or 3 parking spaces that are available on any given block, which is what you want to achieve. So that's just keep that in perspective as I go through the slides, is the target of 85% and being over that, what that actually means. And as you can see, again, the 4 count days, all relative to the 85%, they were below the 85% target, indicating that the parking is, in some cases, underutilized, but in other cases, it's sort of in the well-utilized category. This slide here may be a bit challenging to see, but essentially what we're showing here is the map on the left side of the screen there is showing the peak hour parking utilization, so October 5th, that Wednesday at 1 p.m. You can see a lot of red lines, a lot of dark red lines on the map there for a lot of the streets like Beacon Avenue and parts of 4th and 3rd, really just indicating that, again, the parking utilization was over 85%, so over the target, which means that there wasn't a lot of parking availability at that particular time. The map on the right is showing you the peak day, so October 5th, and that's just an average of the overall parking across the day. So you'll see a lot less red in the map on the right, and you'll see sort of more, peach and orange colors, indicating that sort of the parking utilization on average over the course of the day was well below the 85% target. This one here, this slide is showing the parking utilization seasonal variation. So the idea here is that we wanted to look at, is there, or hypothesize about seeing a difference in parking demand between the summer or late summer and the fall. To see, basically the thinking was, in the sort of the peak tourism season, is parking demand can be higher compared to the shoulder season or the off season. So we did the counts when we could do the counts, not in the middle of summer, but just when we started the project, which was at the end of August. So we mobilized quickly to do the counts, and you can see here, Wednesday, August 31st compared to Wednesday, October 5th, the parking demand was actually higher on that October count day, at about 76%, as you can see, compared to the August 31st count day, which was lower in terms of parking utilization. 2016 versus 2022. So I'm sure there's a lot of interest from council and the public to see what actually changed in 5-6 years since the last study was done. This slide here really shows you that the results are fairly consistent in that parking demand or parking utilization peaks around 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. For both studies. 1 p.m. for the 2022 study, and you can see those lines, the blue being the 2022 and the green being the 2016. But again, both being below that red dashed line, the target. I just want to be clear here too that this does indicate that given all the growth that the town has seen in the last 6 years, residential growth, commercial growth, basically a bigger population in the downtown, it still hasn't necessarily increased the overall parking utilization. There's a number of factors that can explain that, but I just want to highlight that with a growing downtown population, the utilization has not increased significantly. Parking duration is another way to measure overall parking conditions in any community, really. What this means is it's essentially looking at the total duration of time that a vehicle parks on any given block or in an off-street parking lot, for example. So, some vehicles might park for several hours and not, for example, be observing the time limit that's in effect. So it's a bit hard to see that map there, but more importantly, this is the more interesting map, which is showing parking duration, and in particular, where on average parking duration exceeded the time restrictions. So you could see, for example, on Beacon Avenue, which has a 1 hour restriction for most of that corridor, we did see with our data vehicles parking on average longer than the 1 hour, suggesting that they're not following the time restriction, and that could be an area for increased enforcement, for example. There's also other parts of the study area where you can see those the red lines where the time restriction was being exceeded. So parking utilization, the commercial core area. So the reason why we wanted to zoom into this particular area is because also in the 2016 study, and I also forgot to mention that the 2016 study and the 2022 study are also not exactly the same. So it's not a complete apples to apples comparison. I just want to be clear about that. The big difference here is that the 2022 parking study was more extensive. It included more parking spaces in the analysis compared to 2016. So I just want to point that out, that they are a little bit different, but it's still useful to compare. So the 2016 study did present parking demand results for the commercial core area, which you can see in this map here. Sort of James White Boulevard to the north, for the northern boundary, Bevan Avenue is the southern boundary, 7th to the west, and then essentially Ocean, we'll call it, or the Ocean, to the east. So we want to look at, sort of isolate the results to kind of drill deeper into the parking conditions for this particular area as a subset of the study area. What you can see is, again, on all 4 count days, both the August, September, and the 2 October count days, the overall parking utilization was below the 85% target utilization. Parking utilization for the east-west corridor, so these are Bevan and Beacon. We initially looked at James White and Ocean, but we excluded them because the utilization was too low. So we thought it'd be more meaningful just to focus in on Bevan and Beacon. And what you can see here is Beacon Avenue, for certain times of the day, was at or above the 85% target. And I'll show you in my next slide some more details on that. But more importantly, Bevan Avenue had very low parking utilization compared to Beacon, just to be clear. So Beacon Avenue, this is obviously one of the most interesting corridors, of course. It's the commercial high street, or commercial main street, lots of commercial activity, and we wanted to make sure we understood and sort of looked at the results for this corridor. And as you can see, for most of the count days, from essentially 11 a.m. to 2, the parking utilization goes above that red line, that red dashed line, the target, indicating that the available parking supply is not meeting the demand. Demand is exceeding that supply. Again, it's only at certain times of the day, but that does suggest that parking management tools are needed to help address that problem. And that goes back to what I said earlier about the 85% target. Once you're above that, that's usually when communities start to look at different tools like paid parking to help manage that demand. It's done in communities right across North America. In terms of the north-south corridors, we looked at First Street, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th Street. I think the results or the slide speaks for itself. We're just indicating that clearly First Street is the busiest of those north-south corridors, being close to the target 85% utilization, but indicating that essentially all of these streets here are being well utilized, which is, again, a very good sign. Now, parking utilization for the Rest Haven area, as I mentioned, Rest Haven, you can see in the top left corner there, that's essentially the study area, or the subset of the study area for where we looked at Rest Haven Drive. We looked at both the lot there and also the on-street conditions. And I guess the take-home message for this slide is that the parking conditions are very, not very busy. They're underutilized, if anything. You can see the lot on average had 11% utilization over the course of the day. And then you look at Rest Haven Drive, the north side was far less busy than the south side. Now, the parking utilization of the downtown employee and public parking lot, Mary Winsper, as I mentioned, that was one of the actions in the 2016 study, a recommendation. It's good to see that it's being utilized in terms of a good investment from the town. But as you can see in the results, it has a lot more capacity to absorb more parked vehicles, with the overall average across the 4 count days, 37%, and the weekday average, when we think there's more employees in general working downtown compared to the weekend, was at 47%. So it still has capacity to absorb some of that parking demand, whether it's from on street or the other lots, and I can speak to that a bit later. The intercept survey. Okay, so the intercept survey has been mentioned tonight already, and I want to be very clear, this was not a statistically valid survey, just to be clear. That was not the intent of it. The intent was we took a data-driven approach for the parking data collection to count vehicles on 4 days, which consistent with parking methodology and best practices. The intercept survey, the idea of it was to get a different perspective on parking conditions in the downtown by speaking to the public. That was customers. We talked to business owners, employees, visitors, to really understand from their perspective, how is parking working for them? What's their overall experience? Not intended to be a scientific process, just to be clear. That was not the purpose. So understand the parking behaviors and characteristics of those arriving downtown was the first point. The second is to understand the perception of parking conditions from those user groups that I just mentioned. The survey was conducted on the following dates. So we did essentially three of the count days. Total of 156 people were engaged, which, given the purpose of the survey, not a bad sample. Again, doesn't have to be it was not a statistically valid survey. So we thought that was a relatively good snapshot to understand what people's experiences with parking. And this is one of the results from that survey. Satisfaction with downtown parking. As you can see, about 65%, or just short of 65%, were satisfied with the overall downtown parking. And there's obviously more detailed results in the study, which I'm happy to speak to later. But a few other highlights from the intercept survey. We also asked a question or presented different ideas to the public in terms of what can be done to address parking-related challenges. And these are the ones that rose to the top. More free short-term parking, better wayfinding to long-term parking lots, pavement markings to delineate on-street parking, development of a parkade to improve access to daily long-term parking, and then enhanced sidewalks and more bike infrastructure to support active transportation. So kind of a mix of ideas there from the people that we spoke with in terms of what they want to see. But really our key takeaways for from this intercept survey is that most of the people we spoke with are generally satisfied with parking conditions. They don't have a hard time finding parking, and they find parking right away. Doesn't speak for everyone, but that's just from the sample, from the survey. And what really kind of emerged from this exercise was that the desire for a parkade, which is one of the ideas that rose to the top, is really driven by the perception of a parking problem, but it's not actually required at this time, at least based on the data that we collected. And it's unlikely to be required in the future if other parking management tools are explored and implemented by the town. What is quite clear as well is that better wayfinding to long-term parking lots should also be explored, because some people they're looking for a long-term parking option, for example, 3-hour parking, because they might have an errand that takes 3 hours, but they don't know where those lots are, and they park on street and they have to move their vehicle because of parking enforcement, so on and so forth. So there's probably a better way to direct people to those lots so they can seek the long-term parking they need and not utilize on-street parking. So moving into the recommendations, which I'll speak to at a fairly high level. This slide here is showing you the guiding principles. So we came up with 4 of them, and the guiding principles are really intended to sort of serve as the foundation for all the strategies we came up with. They're really meant to inform the strategic approach to guide the town on parking management decisions moving forward. So the guiding principles we came up with are, first, parking as a limited resource. So essentially similar to a natural resource, increasing parking supply may not reduce its demand, so it's very much rooted in economic theory. There are better ways to manage parking instead of just adding supply, which doesn't address the problem. You need to address the demand side of the equation. Accessible parking, continue to consider and monitor the need for accessible parking to ensure those who need parking most are prioritized. That's a really important point, and I have a couple slides on that. Accessible parking is critical. We recognize the demographics of Sydney, and if anything, there should be more accessible parking for those who actually need it. Sustainable transportation options, this directly in line with the town's official community plan and the draft active transportation plan about the need to move away from single occupancy vehicle for most people towards transit, walking, cycling, and other options to address the climate crisis, to address traffic congestion related issues, so on and so forth. And then long-term parking options, continue to consider long-term or all-day parking for employees to accommodate their parking needs and to reduce pressure on street parking supplies, which are in high demand and often in limited supply. So there's 4 strategy areas that we came up with, and I'll walk you through each one. So on-street parking management is the first one, and you can see there's a number of actions that we came up with here. A number of them are operational in nature, and there's again a lot more detail on those in the study. But I think what I'll do is I'll just do a little deep dive into some of them to provide a bit more context for the ones we think are really critical. So the first one here is Action 1E, which is consolidate passenger pickup and drop-off zone. So the town has, as I mentioned, a mix of these short-term restrictions: 5-minute parking, 10-minute parking, 15-minute parking. It's not clear why, and they're not even defined in the streets and traffic bylaw what the intent is of those restrictions. So why not just consolidate them into one passenger zone, which is a practice that other communities are also looking into. They could accommodate taxis, they could accommodate ride-hailing if Uber or some future Uber comes to Sydney. Food delivery vehicles as well. So really vehicles that only require up to 5 minutes. They should be using those stalls and not use the 1-hour stalls, which are valuable and in high demand. So the recommendation in the study is really for a policy to indicate where these zones are permitted. We provide some guidance on how this policy could be created. 1 passenger zone per block per side for some of the streets like Beacon, potentially Bevan, First and Second as examples. Allow them in locations where a high level of pickup and drop-off activity is anticipated, such as hotels and mixed-use buildings, for example, where you might see higher drop-off and pickup activity, for example, or food delivery vehicles and that kind of thing. Action 1F, adopt on-street accessible parking design standards. So we've, essentially with this one, it's recognizing that the town has, of course, a changing, aging demographic. There's still a need to make sure you provide parking for those who need it most, including those who are aging, those with mobility impairments, and so on and so forth. The town has 5 on-street accessible parking spaces today, and their design is pretty inconsistent. One stall looks completely different from the next. So what you can get with consistent design is you make it easier for users to actually find those parking spaces, and you also reduce instances of misuse of accessible parking. When people who don't have a parking permit, accessible parking permit, are parking in these spaces, sometimes they don't know because it's not signed well or it's not indicated well, and sometimes they're doing it intentionally. But the point is that if you can better, like in this example you see on the slide, there's an example from Victoria, but again, there's communities as small as Cumberland, BC, that are doing this as well. They're improving the design of their on-street parking. So that's a provision of an access aisle, so that the yellow square there behind the space, to make it easier for people to get in and out of their vehicle, for wheelchair users, that is. A curb ramp aligned with the access aisle so they can get to the sidewalk easily. Paint those curbs blue so they're easily identifiable. Then clear signage and pavement markings are critical as well. So the study has a lot more detail on what that includes, but pretty easy and low-hanging fruit to have those standards in place so that the town can start to move in that direction of having consistently designed accessible parking stalls for the betterment of both residents and also visitors. Action 1G, increase the supply of commercial loading and accessible parking stalls. The idea with this one is that the OCP directs more commercial growth in the downtown over the next several years. Currently, there's only 3 commercial loading zones. In some communities, accessible parking spaces are actually misused by commercial vehicles, including parcel delivery vans, construction vehicles, food delivery, et cetera. So the idea with this is that there's an opportunity here to actually put them in the same location, an accessible parking stall and a commercial loading stall. They both benefit from having access to a curb ramp, for example. And they can, by doing that, again, you're sort of meeting the need of both commercial growth and also the need for accessible parking. So the study has recommendations on where those stalls could be located. Action 1H, pilot paid parking on Beacon Avenue. So I know this one has a lot of interest from the community. I just want to be really clear that there is there's very strong policy support in the OCP for various parking demand management tools, including paid parking. So that's right in the town's policy documents. Paid parking, to be really clear, is most efficient and effective when parking utilization exceeds the 85% utilization target. That's based on lots of research, lots of articles, lots of communities who have also done this. So when it exceeds that 85%, just to be clear. Purpose is to manage parking demand and not generate revenue. This is really an opportunity to sort of test the impact or test the waters of this tool and signal that parking is a limited resource in the commercial core area, which goes back to the guiding principle that I mentioned a few slides ago. So the recommendation, just to be brief, establish a base parking rate for hourly pricing on Beacon Avenue. Payment would not be in effect, would be in effect Monday to Saturday from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., so evenings be free, and also on weekends. And we're just suggesting that, or recommending this is just for Beacon Avenue, where, again, it's justified based on the demand. And introducing it as a pilot project could be a good way to see if it's working, if it's effective, and what could potentially be changed. Just checking with the chair. Am I doing okay on time?
5 minutes.
5 minutes, thank you. I'll wrap it up in 5. On-street parking management, so we got 4 actions, which you can see on the screen here. I'll just speak to one of them in a bit of detail. Action 2B, allow long-term overnight parking in the Mary Winsper lot and the employee public lot. So the idea with this one is that we know that demand for monthly parking, but also overnight parking in Lot F continues to be high, and that's based on a staff report from August 2022, where they looked at sort of who are the permit holders for that lot. And I should be clear that Lot A and Lot F also swapped restrictions halfway through our study, which has resulted in some confusion. But the bottom line is that based on our parking study, the downtown employee and public parking lot at Mary Winsper has low parking utilization. And essentially our recommendation here is that there's an opportunity to reduce the number of parking spaces for monthly long-term parking, so more for employee parking, in Lot F. We know employee parking is critical, to be clear, but you can reallocate some of those stalls in Lot F to more short-term parking to accommodate the needs of customers, and move some of that monthly parking to the Mary Winsper lot, where we know there's capacity. based on our data. And we're also saying too that there's an opportunity to accommodate overnight parking there. So people who don't have access to an off-street parking space in their downtown apartment building, for example, we're not saying accommodate everyone, but if there is a wait list right now, if there's capacity in that lot, there's an opportunity to accommodate both monthly parking and also overnight parking to help ease that pressure on street parking and the town's lots. Just a few more slides here and I'll wrap up. Strategy area 3, TDM and sustainable, so transportation demand management and sustainable transportation. There's a number of actions in here. I'm not going to go into any of them in detail because a lot of them are really supported in the OCP, the town's OCP, and also the draft active transportation plan. But the one that I will highlight that I think would be of interest to council is action 3E, which is increasing the supply of publicly accessible EV charging stations. There's OCP policy direction to continue to support EVs or electric vehicles by investing in the public EV charging infrastructure. There's only more and more demand for EVs. It's growing, and the province has targets, of course. There are charging stations currently available across the town. All the stations are non-networked, which we call sort of dumb stations. They don't provide any information about how well they're utilized, all the non-network ones, compared to a smart station, which BC Hydro has, which provides you all the different indicators you want on how that station's performing, which gives the town a lot of benefit, including if the town's currently a participant in a grant application led by the CRD to obtain funding for network stations, and hopefully that comes through, because that is very much one of our recommendations, which are on the bottom slide here. So one, introducing a fee for charging, so you can get more turnover of those charging stations. Making the stations networked also allows the town to apply to the province's low carbon fuel standard, and because once your stations start being utilized, they generate credits, and then you can sell those credits on the market and get revenue, which helps offset the operating costs and capital costs of those stations. And I can speak to those in more detail. And then lastly, provide access to garage orphans, which are essentially people who, it's a colloquial term for people who don't have access to home charging because they don't have a garage or a driveway. The idea here is that the town has an opportunity, as it expands its EV charging network, put some stations on street or curbside, especially in locations where you have a higher density of old multifamily buildings from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, because those people cannot charge at home, and they may want to actually get a vehicle, an electric vehicle. So this is it's sort of from an equity perspective. And then the last strategy area is parking data management, where we have a number of actions, including undertaking the study every 5 years, so you can actually see what's changed and whether any of the actions have been effective. And I will just conclude with some key takeaways. Thanks for all your patience and all the numbers and data that I've walked you through, but I think it was important context. Really, the key takeaways from my presentation, key takeaways from the study, are overall the results indicate that parking conditions in the study area are underutilized. In some cases, they are well utilized, just to be clear. So that slide should probably be adjusted to say that. It just depends on where we're talking in the study area. Public parking is broadly available throughout the day in both on-street and off-street locations. Parking management tools and transportation demand management can help encourage people to change their habits and behavior to have a more pleasant parking experience in the downtown. That's really the intent of the parking management tools, is to better manage parking and improve the overall experience for residents and also visitors coming to Sydney. So with that, thank you very much, and looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Shaw, and I'll now turn to my committee colleagues to see if the questions for the presenter. Any questions? Councillor Garnett.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Shaw, for your presentation. I'll be the one to lead off here, I guess. With regards to methodology, I'm just curious because I know 2016 was the same as 2022. Why were only 4 days selected as your sample? I'm just wondering what the reasoning or rationale behind that was.
Thank you for through the chair to Councillor Garnett. Thanks for the question. The 4-day count methodology was informed by the 2016 study, which also had 4 count days. So as I mentioned, not an apples-to-apples comparison because the study was more extensive to include more data, but we wanted to be as consistent as we could be with the 2016 study, and that's why we did the 4 count days, which was exactly done for the 2016 study.
Okay, yeah, I'm just one of those more data kind of people. So as far as October 5th, In the study, it mentions that, oh, sorry.
I think we have a clarification from staff. Ms. Larry?
Thank you. Through to Councillor Garnett. I do want to clarify that the number of study days was governed by budget.
Okay.
Watt did have a very robust data collection compared to some of the other proposals we received.
I was wondering if that was part of the reasoning. Thank you. With regard to October 5th, now there was one section on 7th that wasn't counted because it was closed, so I'm wondering, I know you only had a limited time frame to do this study, but why another day wasn't selected if town staff had worked with you with regards to road closures and within your study area, and why it went ahead with that day knowing there might have been a road closure?
Through the chair to Councillor Garnett. Ms. Clary, do you want to respond to this question? Sorry. Or do you want me to take a stab?
Sure, through to Councillor Garnett. So some of the work is hard to predict in timing. For paving, our schedule is heavily dependent on the contractor, so we had scheduled Watt far in advance and we couldn't adjust last minute.
Okay, thank you. If I may, sorry. But one of the things that really stuck out to me is not taking any data during noon. And I'm wondering, because quite possibly that would have been your peak hour had you actually measured it, given how high 1 o'clock was, and would have affected possibly the overall averages. So I'm wondering, in particular, why that hour was chosen as a time not to collect data.
Through the chair to Councillor Garnett. Our data collectors were busy on their feet for 10 hours. And just to be clear, we wanted to give them a lunch break, just to be sort of civilized in the whole process. So we selected noon as the logical time for that lunch hour. On the 4 count days, sometimes we finished lunch at 12:45 and we started counting at that time. I think the overall difference would still be pretty marginal. I think 1 o'clock still gives you an overall good sense of the busiest time of the day.
Okay, fair enough. And sorry. With regards to, and not including parking that's less than an hour, was there a reason for that? And do you think that would have had any impact on your results?
Through the chair, no, not necessarily, because first off, again, we were consistent with the methodology in 2016, 2016 study, which counted hourly. It's also consistent with research and industry, which often do, for these downtown type of parking studies, they're often done on an hourly basis, unless you have a team of 30 counters, for example, right, and all the technology in the world to count on a half-hour basis. But often the hourly counts are in line with methodology in other downtown parking studies that are done.
I have a few more, but I'll ask one and then I'll leave for other people. The one I'm having the most difficulty with is around Lot E, the numbers for Lot E and Mary Winspear employee parking lot. And it's just, it's not a perception question. I walk into Sydney in the last probably 3 months, every Tuesday and Thursday, and that's the path I take home. And so the numbers that you're counting, I'm not disagreeing with your count numbers from when you took them, but they're so different from what I see when I walk by there in and around 1 o'clock, 1:30, when these lots are almost completely full. So I'm having a hard time in my mind embracing the contradiction in the numbers that from when you looked at and from what I've seen in the last 3 months. And I'm wondering, is there anything you think that might have caused that? Maybe winter weather, people are driving their cars more. Maybe when you did it, they were on bike and walking more. Do you have any rational or reasoning that the differences could be so great, just from actually looking at it and counting spaces?
Through the chair, it's hard to say. There can be a number of factors contributing to that. It could be on certain days, if the weather's not as good, people's travel behavior decisions change based on weather, which is consistent in any community. So it's hard to give you a definitive answer for that. We counted it hourly over the course of the day, and at certain points of the day it was quite busy, and other points of the day was less busy. And that's why we're using the average here, just to present the overall conditions.
Great, thank you. I have more, but I'll leave it for other members. Thank you, Chair. Thank you.
I'll turn to Councillor Novak.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Shaw, for your presentation. And obviously a lot of hard work went into this. Mr. Chair, I have 3 or 4 questions. I hope that's okay. If you think I'm taking too much time, feel free to rattle my cage. Just as a follow-up to Councillor Garnett's questions about the days, I'm a bit curious as to why the days weren't randomized. Taking two pairs of days that are the same would suggest to me that the data might be skewed, rather than if there were a randomized selection out of those 7 days that form a week. I would suggest Fridays would be busier than Wednesdays, and Sundays would be a lot less busy, of course. Is there a reason why those days selected weren't randomized?
Through the chair, thank you,
Novak.
Councillor Novak.
I know it's hard to read from that angle.
And sorry, Ms. Claire, do you want to speak to just the schedule? And I can speak to the methodology on the days, just the project schedule.
Sure, I can give a bit of background around why the counts were done when they were. So Watt was really engaged in August, I'd say, and we wanted to have this parking data available by the time the active transportation plan was kind of coming to completion. So that is why doing the work in August and October, it was a bit of an accelerated schedule. Ideally, you would have a whole year to collect data, but it doesn't always work with that with competing schedules. But yeah, now I'll pass it back over to Mr. Shaw.
Thank you for that. And so yeah, but in terms of the sort of randomizing the count days, I think was part of your question. Often in parking, downtown parking methodology, for methodologies that are done for downtown parking studies, you want to be as consistent as you can on your count days. So usually it's a weekday and a weekend day, which is usually, especially for a community like Sydney that does have tourism, it does give you a picture of parking conditions on a weekday versus the weekend. Counting on a Friday is not recommended in best practice because some people might be out of town, for example, might get away for the weekend, which would then present lower overall parking conditions. So we counted on our 2 weekday days, were Wednesday, which is right in the middle of the week when we know, at least from our experience in other communities and based on best practices, that's usually a good representative sample of parking conditions. And then the weekend was just for the reasons I mentioned, and we want to be consistent. Two count days in fall, then, or in the summer, then the two count days in the fall.
Okay, thank you. The parking study mentions Town of Sydney's active transportation plan, but there's not a lot of discussion about the impact on parking in the town, nor how the parking requirements might change over time with the implementation of the ATP. Is that a scope question, or do you want to give me some background on that, please?
Sure, through to Councillor Novak. The staff report does indicate that Watt is able to do a detailed analysis of if the proposed parking loss from the active transportation plan, if it actually was implemented, Watt could look at where those cars that are currently parked in those locations would go if the parking was lost along those certain corridors. And yes, it was a scope thing. Like Watt was hired to do the downtown parking study. The active transportation plan is being done by Urban Systems, or 2 different consulting groups. So although these studies do complement each other and the plans do complement each other, they are 2 different papers, 2 different studies, 2 different plans.
Thank you, Ms. Clary, through chair. Well, that was going to be one of my next questions. You partially answered it, and it was with reference to Bevan, where there's a lot of people going for medical appointments and stuff, and that parking, on-street parking, might ultimately be lost by the ATP. And are you suggesting that there may be a future study to determine how that loss of parking would be remediated?
Councillor Novak, I'm going to call for a point of order here. I don't know if the proponent can offer that. It might be a question you asked during to staff once the report's received.
Fair enough. Last question. In item 5.3.4, It's suggested that adding bicycle parking will compensate for the loss of street parking on Bevan and Fifth. Is this correct? And if so, how does that work?
Through the chair to Councillor Novak, can you point which page, if you have it handy? You said it's section 5.3.4?
Section 5.3.4, yes. I will look for... Yeah, I think it's page 82.
Yeah, Councillor Novak, I understand your question. So what we wrote there was trying to say that if the priority projects go ahead as identified in the draft active transportation plan, so in this case the protected bike lanes on Bevan, for example, which would result in loss of parking, what we're suggesting is there is an opportunity to provide bicycle parking, to provide an option for people who are biking into the town. So it's not, so we use the word offset, but we're trying to say that because with bike parking, for one, you can get a lot more bike racks provided on a per square basis compared to vehicle parking. So if there's a loss in vehicle parking that accompanies a bike lane, installation of bike lane, there's still opportunities to put in bike parking to still make it easy for people who choose to bike to come downtown and find a place to park their bike. That's what we're trying to say there.
Okay, but the way it's worded would suggest that putting in the bike lanes would offset the loss of parking on streets like Bevan. And the people that come and park on Bevan, I think I'd be hard pressed to suggest they would be coming downtown on bicycle instead. Now, maybe that's just how I've interpreted it, but.
Mr. Shaw, your colleague might have additional information to offer. He's come on screen. So.
Thank you, Chair. Philippos, go ahead.
Good evening, Mayor and Council, through the Chair. I just turned on my camera because I had a comment earlier and I was instructed to turn on my camera and raise my virtual hand, so to speak, in order to address any comments. No comment for this one in specific.
Thank you. Councillor Novak, have you completed your questions?
I'm good for now. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, I'll turn to Councillor Rintoul.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Shaw, for the presentation. I appreciate the insight you provided further to the report this evening, and thankful of staff for bringing this forward and Council's recognition that this is an important item for the community and for us to continue to monitor. I like a lot of what's here. That seems like low-hanging fruit. Profiling accessible parking spaces, helping to raise the awareness of those locations, I think is important. Wayfinding to the public lots and improving on that was a great recommendation, and standardizing parking times. So there's lots of really good things in here. Interesting, when you did the survey of people who had you bumped into on the street and you queried them on their parking, 28% of them said delineate parking spaces so that we can see where the spaces are. And yet in your recommendations, you say don't delineate parking spaces. So I'd like you to speak to that, and then I have a second question, if I might, Chair.
Through the Chair to Councillor Rintoul, thanks for the question. The recommendation to remove the parking stall markings or delineated stalls is really driven by sort of a parking sort of operational perspective, in that yes, there are some benefits to having those, but they're also maintenance, and they require, they have to be painted every so often. So from a maintenance and operational point of view, that's the rationale of the recommendation to remove them. And then secondly, the people don't always park properly in those delineated stalls. There's overhang, so as a result, there's some inefficiencies. So in some cases, you might be able to get, for example, 10 vehicles on any given block, but because there's only, there's 8 or 7 delineated stalls, there's about 7 vehicles parking there that they're trying to park within those markings, but you can actually get more vehicles, more efficient, which accommodates more vehicles on any given block. So that's just another perspective on it. And yes, I appreciate your observation about the intercept survey, and people did mention that. But I think where that's coming from is the fact that it's just people not having, or some people coming to downtown not having all the information about where to find parking. I think that's one of the sort of overarching challenges we've observed.
Thank you. And is that a trend you're seeing in other communities going this route?
Through the chair, other communities, communities that are moving towards paid parking, for example, are putting in delineated stalls or numbered stalls, or like just numbered posts to actually identify them, because you need to identify your stalls in order for paid parking to work. But in other communities that don't have that, or just have essentially limited parking restrictions, there's really no purpose in having those stalls delineated because of the maintenance requirements involved.
Okay. Thank you. And if I may, Mr. Chair, and forgive me, I don't think I'm going to articulate this very well, but I keep wondering, in your area of expertise, is there not a linkage? And I don't think it was explored in this, and I'm assuming it was out of scope, but I'm trying to understand if it should be, or if at least we should see some recommendations in the area around our parking and our bylaw requirements with respect to commercial parking requirements on developments. And so you can let me know if it was, or Ms. Clary can, if it was in or out of scope. And then I would like to hear from Watt whether or not there is a linkage there we should be considering. And I look at it not just through the lens of this undertaking, but also future development. For example, a very small lot that may have a very high requirement for commercial parking spaces, whether or not that should have or could feed into this survey to give us a little further data or future insight. So apologies for the wordiness of that, but I hope I got through what I was looking for here.
Sure, through to Councillor Rintoul. The first part of your question, the private parking was not included as part of the scope of Watt's project. It was purely to look at the public on-street and off-street parking spaces.
And that was the same as 2016, correct?
I believe so.
Through the chair, 2016 had some recommendations around looking at parking standards, off-street parking standards, but the overall scope of that study was very much focused on public parking, not on private parking.
Thank you.
And if I may, Councillor Rintoul, to answer your the second part of your question, which I'm still trying. I think I understand it, but in terms of just commercial parking requirements and the impact that might have on-street parking, like if there's any spillover, is that so? I like if you're so yeah, not in scope, of course, but if you're doing a bigger, more robust parking analysis, you can look at you could look at the off-street parking requirements for commercial establishments, for example. But more importantly, you need to actually look at what their parking demand is, because parking requirements are one thing, but you need to also understand how much parking do they actually generate. And to do that, you can do a survey. You could actually do a travel survey with customers, for example, with the employees of that commercial establishment to understand, are they being accommodated off-street in their parking lot, or are they requiring on-street parking and parking in the Mary Winsper lot, for example, or in the town's off-street lots. So that's a way to do that, but you'd have to a lot more work, and you'd have to look at all the different commercial establishments to understand parking demand at them.
Thank you. And just as a parting comment, Chair, if I may, I can't help but think that isn't in such a condensed downtown area that those linkages are probably important for us to better understand. So I'll leave it there. Thank you, Mr. Shaw.
I'll now turn to Councillor Duncan.
Thank you. I have 3 questions. Some of them have been asked in a different form before, and but I'm going to ask them in new ways and see if new information comes out. So the first is regarding the survey timing. And I'm just wondering, because I know there's been questions about it, and of course public comments on that, and when I looked at it, I went, oh, okay, so the October is close, and we still might have a fair amount of potential tourist season in early October. And so to me, I'm worried, you know, if people are going to wonder about whether the timing captured typical, say, like peak summertime, which is what you're looking at with your August 31st, and then off peak with October, that the risk we're running is more towards having basically 2 peak versus not capturing an off-peak. However, when Councillor Garnett brought up the Merry Wind Spear at this time and wondered whether it was, you know, poor weather and now employees are actually taking their cars, or perhaps, you know, they're not on vacation anymore. And I'm just wondering, because there's probably, you know, standard best practices and kind of an idea. I know, you know, about, I did vegetation surveys, so it was always just like, you know, May to October was your growing season. That, you know, within parking studies, you kind of, you know, based on the way cities typically operate, would it be more likely that we've captured a higher overall parking in our off-peak than the opposite mistake of having gotten a lower off-peak? And I'm just wondering which direction the error might be. And some councillors have already somewhat asked that in terms of, you know, if we didn't capture, like if there was a noon peak. I'm looking at the smooth lines, and I'm not worried so much about that, but I do worry about which direction October might have caught versus, say, if we'd done the same survey in February.
Through the chair to Councillor Duncan, you know, thanks for that question. I just want to go back to a point that Ms. Clary brought up, which is about just we're working with the project schedule, and we started in August, and we wanted to make sure we were working towards this accelerated schedule. So that was, I guess that's part 1 of my answer to you. Part 2 is it should be noted that the 2016 study, just based on its project schedule, did include counts in December, which is probably more off peak, if you will, in terms of parking demand. And as I showed in the slides, the overall parking conditions from 2016 are analogous to 2022. Yes, there are some differences in the methodology of those 2 studies, but the count days were done at different times of the year, including in December. So we have some confidence that the count days that we selected may represent more of the peak, if you will, and more of that sort of high season. But we still think that October is different from August. And we just wanted to make sure that we selected, based on the schedule we're working with, make sure we selected a date that was still different from August, September, to see what those parking conditions were like. So hope that answers your question.
Oh, no, it's good. I think for the public benefit of understanding, I think, because we're going to have questions both ways, where on the one hand, people will be worried that we missed a peak and that it's actually parking has higher demand than you found, in which case there is a more pressing need to do something. And then, of course, you know, as other speakers are saying, it looks like there isn't actually that much. What you've found is our parking demand doesn't have as much problem as the perception, and we don't actually have to spend a lot of money to fix this problem. So we're just trying to get a sense of if there was a problem with the methodology that people were critiquing, which direction would the error lie? And it sounds to me like what you're saying is based on, you know, the comparison with 2016 and 2022, and that if anything, that would be that we are overestimating, even still possibly, what the parking demand is, and so that there's even potentially less need to be really worried about taking aggressive action to solve a parking problem versus that we missed a bigger parking problem than we have.
Through the chair to Councillor Duncan. Not sure if that was a question, but
it wasn't.
But it's hard for me to we want to stick to the data as best as we can, for this study. That's what very much what we did, and we try to make sure the recommendations we came up with go back to that data, so it's supported by it. But it's hard for me to say, if we had done the parking study in December or January, February, how the results would be different. But based on when we did do the parking study, we did capture pretty busy conditions. That was the intent of the August and September count, because we captured that long weekend, right? That Labor Day weekend. In October, we also captured at least part of the peak, like you're saying, but we don't know, is October different from February? It's hard for us to truly conclude that without having actually counted on those days.
Okay, thank you. The second question is about, the parkade comes up again. Was that originally even included? Is this something that's just people have volunteered when you've done surveys, either 2016 and this year, and said, a parkade? Or is this something that, you've been instructed to ask about how people feel about it, through staff, or something that has come through from public requests previously? I mean, I know I've seen it in letters to the editor, in newspapers previously, but I'm just wondering, when I look at it and I look at what our potential problem is, it would not even close to feasibly be solved by a parkade. And so I keep wondering why it keeps coming up as a potential solution that we're looking at.
Through to Councillor Duncan, it is something that's in our OCP to continue to consider a parkade in downtown Sydney. So that is why it's continued to be considered.
Okay. What a shame. And my third and final question was, you have these recommendations to increase the accessible parking, and that was definitely seemed to be identified as something that we are under parked for accessible parking. And I know that the province just came in with new standards for accessible parking. So is there a target that we're trying to get to for how many spaces we need to have for on-street parking? We know that there's standards for off-street parking and private parking when people build something, but is there kind of like a target percentage we're looking at, or spaces per block, or per linear feet of road? Or is it just the kind of thing where we're looking at where it's possible based on kind of the existing road cuts and safety and things like that?
Through the chair to Councillor Duncan, really like that question. I think it's a really important one. I wish there was an answer for it. Based on all the research we've done, there isn't a set ratio that's done that's sort of at the provincial level for municipalities to follow. I think it's truly done on an ad hoc basis, depending on the needs of the community. So we didn't want to provide a ratio in the study for that reason. But more focus on, here are the standards that should be adopted, that are based on best practices to really improve the parking experience for people who require these stalls. The City of Edmonton does, I believe, have a target or ratio they're moving towards. I don't know the number off my head, so I'm not going to say it. But it's just an example of a community that is really taking accessible parking seriously, and to the point where they're actually they've created these, or moving towards creating ratios. So it's very clear how many stalls they can provide on any given block, for example. But that's pretty rare based on what I've seen in all the work I've done on parking and accessible parking. There just aren't best practices around the ratio. So hopefully that answers your question.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Thank you.
I'll turn to Councillor O'Keefe.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. In terms of the, when you were looking at those problem areas where parking duration was the issue, where people are parking longer than they should, did you have access to our parking enforcement data? Like, is that something that you kind of look at with this, or is it something that we should be looking at in the future? So when you talk about different tools that we have at our disposal to remedy, say, the parking on Beacon, I'd be more interested, before setting up pay parking, I'd be interested to know, what has our parking enforcement been like on Beacon? And maybe the solution is we need to pump up our presence on that. So just wondering if that factored into any of this.
Through the chair to Councillor O'Keefe. Thanks for that question. We do have so I guess to answer the first part of the question, we didn't look directly at parking enforcement related data as part of this, just to be clear. Robbins Parking did do their own counts for certain blocks to look at overall parking occupancy and duration, but more focused on occupancy, just to sort of see if we can compare some data, but it was a completely different methodology, so it's not an apples to apples comparison. But as far as there is an action in the study, action 1D, section 5.1.4, where we do recommend increasing targeted enforcement on those high parking duration blocks. So that very much is an opportunity to for the town, working with Robbins, the current who currently does parking enforcement, to really focus and look at those blocks where there is where people are parking for longer than the stated time restriction. That's probably the most effective way to do it. Is just more routine, more targeted enforcement to really remind people that they cannot park for example, longer than an hour on Beacon Avenue, or if the town does move in the direction of accepting the recommendation of a passenger zone, so those short-term stalls. Those are also tricky to enforce, but they need to be enforced because parking management is incomplete without good parking enforcement. So parking enforcement has to be sort of done in lockstep with the time restrictions, to make sure that people are complying and that people are moving their vehicles. So it's in the study. We don't spend too much time on it because from our perspective, parking enforcement's working for the most part, but there are ways to do more targeted enforcement to improve the overall parking management.
Okay, thank you. In terms of the, I think I know the answer, but I'll ask anyways, whether you were aware of the ped counter data we have that the town gathers. So it counts a number of footsteps, and I just thought that would be, there's been some concern expressed about, okay, did we pick days that maybe there wasn't too many people around? Was October, a high month or a low month or that sort of thing? So I don't know if you had the opportunity to look at that, but it might be something to look at in the future. I took a quick look at it myself, and it looks to me, from what I see, when you look at the foot traffic outside of Tanner's bookstore, that the dates that you picked were actually pretty representative in terms of average weekly pedestrian traffic. I mean, that's just pedestrians, and it doesn't count all of the people that are in Sydney, downtown Sydney at the time, but it's at least an indicator that you might look at to get a sense of, are those days that you picked representative? So just a comment, I guess. In regards to the accessible spots, so thank you for Councillor Duncan for that question. I was going to ask the same thing. But one other thing in regards to those is I'm curious about the co-location of the accessible parking spaces and the loading zones. Now, I understand the rationale. I guess what I would be concerned about, or should there be a concern that big trucks are going to come in and just say this whole area, even though I understand it would be marked, this is blue for accessible parking and this is loading, but there might be a tendency to take over the whole space, and whether we're better to break that up. So I wonder if you've got any experience or best practice information in regards to how that's played out in other places.
Through the chair to Councillor O'Keefe, not directly. I think it's kind of an idea we're exploring as part of the study, just based on the rationale, based on the fact that unique to Sydney, there's this potential for more commercial growth in the town based on the OCP, and given the fact that there's this aging population, the need, or the underscoring the need for accessible parking, and how both of those sort of called parking user groups require a curb ramp or require access to the sidewalk. So there's not a lot of best practice out there. I'll be frank about that, but it's something that I encourage the town to look more into as it implements this recommendation. In terms of for one block, it might make sense to do that if there's sufficient length to fit both a large commercial vehicle and accessible parking stall. Some blocks it may not make a lot of sense. So we've got recommendations in the report for where these stalls can be located together, but they're going to require further technical exploration from town staff. Right, okay. And sticking with the accessible parking theme, so in the report it talked about if we were to implement pay parking, that the kiosks should be close
to accessible parking spaces on Beacon so that those people could get out and pay easier. And I guess what I'm wondering is, in your previous comments, you talked about the reason for paid parking was to manage, that it's not to make money, it's to manage, trying to get people to park elsewhere. Give them an incentive to, I don't want to spend a few bucks, but if I park on the side street or in the lot, I can save money. And so I'm wondering if you think, if that's the rationale, does it make sense to, in a way, penalize persons who need accessible spots, that they should have to pay for that spot because they don't have the capability to, go around, park several blocks away and then come in with their walker or whatever. So I wonder any further comment on that or best practices from other communities?
Through the chair to Councillor O'Keefe. I think it varies community by community. I think communities that have had paid parking established for a long time have decided to have paid parking in effect for accessible parking as well. But the rates, when you have paid parking, when you design paid parking, you have it in effect, you can design it so many different ways in terms of having a discounted rate, for example, for accessible parking users compared to standard parking stalls. The rate could change based on the time of the day. Paid parking may not, you can waive it on the weekends for certain, so there's all kinds of ways to do it. And I'd have to give you a whole list of examples, but for the purpose of this study, our recommendation to do this pilot project, paid pilot project on Beacon, ultimately, if the town does pursue that, they can look into different rate structures. For example, that could potentially not have the rate in effect for accessible parking users, but that's not what our study just introduces the idea and the rationale for it, backed by the data, but not the specifics around the parking rate design, if that answers your question.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay, that's good. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I'll turn to Mayor McNeil-Smith.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Shaw, for the presentation, and thank you for the lengthy report. I think there's a lot of good information in the report, and I support a number of the recommendations, but we'll have discussion and deliberation on those not only this evening but at future meetings. I do have several questions, and one question is I'm curious to know where Watt may have done a parking study in a community of similar size or similar nature to Sydney. So I'm not sure how far and wide Watt does parking studies, Southern Vancouver Island, all of Vancouver Island, beyond, and that sort of thing. Could you speak to if there's a comparable elsewhere that you might refer to?
Through the chair to the mayor, thank you for the question. We've done parking studies for Central Saanich most recently, for the Keating Business District. So, not exactly the same size as Sydney, but we've done, we did a downtown parking study for the city of Abbotsford a couple of years ago, which is bigger than Sydney, but that's one that comes to mind. We've also done, we did a extensive accessible parking study for the city of Kelowna, but we've also done parking studies in the past for smaller communities like Chemainus, for example, Up Island, Whitehorse in the north. So we like to work with communities of all sizes in doing these parking studies, and we try to, as best as we can, come up with recommendations that are tailored to that community, and only when it makes sense, recommend parking management tools like paid parking if it's justified by the data. So it's we try to be very sensitive when it comes to the recommendations that are suitable for the community that we work with.
A request, if you could perhaps provide staff at a later date after this evening with perhaps a municipality or two that you might, either Central Saanich because it's local or others where you've done studies in the last couple, 3 years, that I think it would be interesting, particularly given some of the recommendations and what might have been actually done in other communities or what might be the outcomes in other communities. the study area is increased in 2022 from the 2016, and I think that's a good thing. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on the 2016 study, but one of the things that was addressed, I think more so in the 2016 study than this study, was the need and challenge of employee parking. And that employee parking occurs in the nearby residential area, north and south of the commercial area. So I appreciate that the larger area was done this time. I think that's a good thing. In one of your introductory slides, and I'm sure it's one of the early tables in the lengthy report, indicates that we have 1,080, or there was 1,087 parking spaces, on-street parking spaces in the study, and 383 off-street. We know the off-street are parking lots, the Mary Winspear lot. But can you, I'm sorry if it's in the report, but can you break down that 1,087, the breakdown between the on-street spaces actually in the commercial core, zone commercial, versus the residential, please? If it's not available readily, could we have that at a future time?
Through the chair to the mayor, I don't have those numbers handy. My colleague Philippos might be looking up as I speak, but it's something that we can look into and get back to you on.
Yeah, if I could, I have a request for a future meeting. And the reason I ask is I don't want there to be a perception, and I think it would be easy for the public to make a perception that we have 1,087, whatever that number is, 1,087 parking spaces downtown, and I'm not referring to the 383 off-street and parking lots. I'm referring to the on-street, and we don't have 1,087 parking spaces in the commercial zone. The other is with regards to the Mary Winspear lot. And we call it the employee parking lot, and the intention was to help resolve the challenges that were highlighted and long known with regards to employee parking in residential areas. I think of that parking lot as predominantly employee used, but I don't know that, and I don't think there was anything in your study that could make a determination of what the balance might be between employee use and patron use. But are you able to break out, so your utilization, you do break out a utilization graph separately for the commercial core, which includes the Mary Winspear parking lot. But given the Mary Winspear parking lot, A, was low on utilization in the study, and B, is generally understood to be employee parking. I would like to see if it's feasible, the way the data was collected, to see the utilization in the commercial core without the Mary Winspear lot. I mean, it's generally understood that the commercial, the on-street parking spaces in the commercial zone that have 1 hour, 2 hour, 3 hour, and some limited space to long-term paid parking, is generally for patrons. We know there are going to be some employees use it on either on a short-term basis or what have you, and we know residents are using it, particularly that we have more residents living in the downtown. But I'd like to request, and maybe I can do it after we go to this and speak to staff about the feasibility of that. But would that be possible, I guess, is my question through you, Mr. Shaw? To break out the utilization for just the commercial space, not including the Mary Winspear Center, or Mary Winspear lot?
Through the chair to the mayor, it is possible, but at this point we've completed our parking study.
I do understand
so
that.
it'd be sort of above and beyond scope at this point.
Okay, no, I understand
but
that.
it is possible.
I appreciate that, and staff do mention that certain information would be an additional scope or additional to this study. I want to speak a little bit to survey timing. You spoke in your presentation to not selecting Fridays because they can actually bump up to a weekend where people may be traveling. Saturday, September 3rd was the Labor Day long weekend. And that is one of the busiest travel periods, as we understand from BC Ferries and just generally. And and I question whether that was representative of a busy summer day in downtown Sydney. The last 2 weeks of August are the busiest time in downtown Sydney of the summer, in the summer period, which you could basically count from the May long weekend through to the through to about Labor Day. And so I question that actually capturing a busy, and then the Friday or the Wednesday, August 31st, is time when people can be away if they're going away for the long weekend as well. So I'll just note that. I know you were trying to be consistent with the 2016 study in terms of Wednesdays and Saturdays, but I question that in terms of it being in that long weekend. The other question I have is, in the 2016 study, you chose December dates. And so you haven't been consistent in choosing, in terms of going from December dates to October dates. And I think everybody would appreciate that it's going to be a lot busier in downtown Sydney in December than it is in late August, early September. Can you speak to the decision to do that, please?
Through the chair to the mayor, with respect to the first part of your question about Labor Day weekend, again, it goes back to the project schedule that we were working with. Yes, I know people are away, but I would imagine, I don't have the data to back us up, there's probably people visiting Sydney as well, Labor Day weekend, Americans and so on and so forth. So I think it goes in both directions. But I don't know what the town's visitation data are like, so I can't speak to that any further. And then as far as the 2016 study, which I was not that involved with, to be honest, I joined Watt later that year. But with that study, I believe that the dates that were selected in December were just based on when the project was initiated, which was in the fall of 2016. Whereas for our project, we initiated this in near the end of August. So I think we were challenged and constrained by when we actually initiated the project for this one compared to the 2016 study. If that answers your question, I'm not sure if Ms. Clary wants to add anything. But
That's helpful, thank you. I'm going to move to, stay with some of the methodology, and that is it's best practices have indicated that an 85% utilization rate is the threshold, best practices threshold for implementing change. The International Association of Shopping Centers takes a different approach, and their research over the last 25, 30 years has been to determine the needs for parking based on square footage of the commercial businesses operating, and generally in malls it's retail and service. So for example, on Uptown's website it indicates they have 3,200 parking spaces. They also list the bus schedules for the 3 most popular routes to Uptown. They list, they promote that they have 250 bicycle spaces. So they're certainly trying to encourage other modes as well. But can you speak, given that we're speaking to a downtown commercial zone that has hundreds of businesses and is widely accepted as a very unique outdoor mall, given its diversity of uses compared to a Mayfair, a Hillside, an Uptown. Can you speak to that best practices versus what commercial business districts such as malls or downtown Sydney might view?
Through the chair to the mayor, thanks for that question. The first thing I'll say is that we're very familiar with that methodology, and we actually do in a lot of the work we do in terms of parking studies for private developments, whether it's a shopping mall or a commercial center. The methodology is different. I just want to say off this. So it's you're coming up with a parking demand rate that's based on, yes, floor area, or it can be number of employees, and there's all kinds of different approaches to do that for figuring out how much parking you should provide for Uptown Mall, for example. But for this study, and just to be really clear, the 85% target is often used in industry for on-street parking. So publicly managed in any, whether it's Los Angeles or Tofino or Sydney, it really doesn't matter which community you're talking about. It's the target that allows the community to understand how busy are their parking conditions truly. It's just a benchmark. You know, are we even close to the 85%? But it really relates to the on-street conditions, which is, you know, if there's 10 spaces on a given block and, you know, eight of those spaces are being occupied, that's generally good, because that means there's 2 spaces that are vacant. So I just want to be clear that the 85% target is very much the threshold we use for on-street and downtown parking studies that are focused on publicly managed parking. There's all kinds of other methodologies and metrics that are used for private parking, like shopping centers, and I think they're entirely appropriate, but not for this particular study.
Thank you for that answer, and I appreciate that it would be a greater challenge, and the methodology would have to change if we were to take that approach, because we do have significant private parking in the commercial zone from a number of businesses, but we do have a large number of businesses that are 100% site covered with their building, and so rely on the on-street parking. But thank you for that. With reference to the 85% peak utilization being a kind of an action threshold, can you speak? I mean, we see within the study that there are sections of the downtown, sections of Beacon Avenue, sections of some of the side streets that reach 85% utilization for certain periods of the day. Does it just have to hit that 85% for a certain small portion of the day to register, or does it have to be 85% for a significant part of the day, period of the day?
Through the chair to the mayor, I think it really depends on the context, to be clear, but in general, it's if that parking block in any given downtown is consistently hitting that 85% or exceeding that 85%. Because if it exceeds it for one moment in time over the course of the day, that's not really representing the true parking conditions of that block. Averages are still obviously important and helpful for context, but when it comes to the 85% target and when parking demand management tools are required, it's often if that block is consistently, at least for a few hours, going over that 85%. And that was the case for Beacon, as I showed in that graph, where it was from about 11 a.m. to 2 p.m., I believe, where it was on the various count days where it was going over that 85%, which justifies the need for something like paid parking, for example.
Okay, thank you. Have you, when you've been doing these studies for other municipalities, does Sunday and holiday parking restrictions on those days ever enter into the conversation? I'm not sure if it was City of Victoria that might be acting in some respects to parking on Sundays and holidays, but has WAD had experience in considerations on those days? I realize it didn't come up in this study, it's not referred to specifically.
Through the chair to the mayor, sorry, just trying to understand your question, just in terms of including like a Sunday or holiday day as part of a parking count?
Has WAD ever made recommendations for there to be parking restrictions on statutory holidays or on Sundays and stat holidays?
Not in my experience.
Okay, thank you. At the beginning of your presentation, when you talked about the comparison of the 2022 to 2016 study, and that given that there was growth in population in Sydney, and indeed there was on the peninsula, but we didn't see an increase in the parking utilization. In the report, or in the study, you draw reference to the fact that the Mary Winspear Park parking was added, and that was a factor perhaps contributing to lower utilization. Councillor O'Keefe made reference to the pedestrian counter, and In 2019, the pedestrian counter at 2436 Beacon Avenue had 807,000, a count of 807,000 for the year 2019. That dropped 240,000 during the first year of the pandemic to 566,000. Rose gradually to 645,000 in 2021, and only rose to 714,000 in 2022. So that was over 93,000 fewer pedestrians in that particular location in 2022 to compared to 2019. And I would suggest that that is a major factor in the utilization. Not to say that 93,000 people were going to drive. It would be whatever proportion is based on the other use. But I think some reference to that in the report is helpful. I think it puts it in better context. But I have a larger concern in that maybe it's a best practice that Sydney has adopted to do a parking study every 5 years. We had a year's delay because of the pandemic, and did it in 6 years this time around. We can hopefully do it in 5 years from now. But I would anticipate, just as the business community has recovered from whether it was 9/11, whether it was the recession associated with 2008, or whether it's coming back from the depths of the pandemic, the commercial zone will get back to those 2019 numbers, and it will go beyond. In the long term, while it's maybe gone like this, it has risen because of population growth, because of growth on BC ferries, because of growth at the airport, and so on. So my concern is that we're going to wait 5 years to do another study, when in fact we may achieve growth back from the pandemic much sooner than that, and 5 years from now might be too late. I appreciate that's a decision that the town has to make, but my question through you, Mr. Shaw, is I don't see a lot of forecasting for the future. I see, okay, let's look at it again in 2 years from now. If 2 years, if it's the paid parking pilot, or 5 years from now if it's another study. But I'm not seeing projections of growth or projections of where Sydney could be or likely be. We have a regional growth strategy for the Capital Regional District, which includes Sydney, and our population is going to increase. So I do see a hand on the screen. Is that Chair? I'll cede the floor for a moment.
Yes, so Mr. Shaw, your colleague, Mr. Kakas, has a
Yes,
comment.
thank you, Chair. Philippos, go ahead.
Yes, through the chair. I think as Tim mentioned in the presentation, definitely the 2016 to 2022 was not meant to be an absolute comparison for the numbers, rather than understanding the trends of when parking utilization tends to peak. I think you're absolutely right. And the last thing I'll say is that in terms of forecasting, that's definitely something that we have done in the past, but it was outside of the scope for this particular parking strategy. I don't know if, Tim, you wanted to add anything on that.
Thank you, Philippos, and through the chair to the mayor. Yes, in fact, we did a parking demand forecast as part of that Keating Business District parking strategy that I mentioned earlier for Central Saanich, and that was very much part of the scope to look at how is the sort of the industrial business park going to change over the next 15, 20 years. And then Philippos did a lot of the hard work on that, came up with a forecast. So it can be done. It just was not part of the scope.
Thank you. The answer is very helpful. My last question, I think, is just to come back to some of the conversation we had over delineated parking line or delineated lines in the parking spaces. And I'm understanding the reply is that there's pros and cons whether the lines are delineated or not. You can have some people, if there are delineated lines, some people don't observe them. Some people have challenges, and so, but at the same time, when there are not parking lines, people will there'll be a very large space that could accommodate 2 cars, and they take a portion of the space that doesn't now actually allow another car to use that other space. So I think those pros and cons, might balance each other out. And I find I find personal experience that some people are confused by the partial markings or markings in some places and others, but we can speak with that a bit later. My question is that you came back on a couple of occasions making reference to the cost of maintaining the lines on the road. I would be interested in hearing if you can provide, apart from the cost, what is the best practice in terms of good parking management, having delineated lines or not?
Through the chair to the mayor, thanks for that question. And I guess in short, the best practice that we have come across is that typically in communities that are moving toward, for example, paid parking management tools, having those stalls marked is crucial because you want to make sure that people are parking in the right stall and that are paying parking for the correct stall, because they're all usually numbered. Or there's like a number post, so if you picture downtown Victoria, but there's also a number of other communities as well. So as far as just an overall best practice, it's hard for me to comment on that because I think every community is different. And I think based on the study that we did for Sydney and based on where Sydney is at today, those delineated parking stalls are doing more harm than good based on our judgment. There could the town explore, if they adopt that recommendation in the future, could the town reintroduce them? Absolutely. And if they move towards, if the town moves towards a paid pilot program, then there could be a need for those stall markings, or just using numbered posts, which are really pretty easy and relatively inexpensive to install, and you don't have to maintain them as much. So kind of a mixed answer or to your question there, but I think it's hard to know because every community is quite different. But I think in general, communities that are moving towards paid parking, there is more of a need to delineate those stalls for better management and inventory of those stalls.
Thank you very much. I appreciate again the presentation, and thank you for taking all the questions. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Before we go to a second round of questions, I've got a couple of just quick questions for you, Mr. Shaw. My colleagues have asked many of the questions I asked, but there's a couple of data points I just want clarification on. You indicated that the airport, YYJ, and the ferry distance from downtown Sydney, is that, where was that measured from? Because they seemed, like the airport's only 2 kilometers, but it's actually door to door. If you're traveling, it's 4 kilometers, and the ferry's not 3, it's 6. So just where was the measurement done from, just in terms of clarification of data points?
Councillor Duck, is there a page?
Page 3.
Page 3?
Of the report.
Okay, so to answer your question, Councillor Duck, that paragraph there, that middle paragraph, is more just referencing the location of Sydney, just to be clear. Okay. It's not, so sorry if that was not clear, but that's not, in fact, I think we sort of paraphrased that from the official community plan, but we put some numbers in it because we like numbers. But I think, so if that number is wrong, apologies, but we're just trying to set the context for where Sydney is in relation to other sort of key destinations. So, yeah.
Thank you. And the other one was just a question of why Lot E, the charging stations there, were not included in any of the, either your presentation tonight or within the data set within the document. Because there are 2 charging stations at Lot E. And just again, why weren't they included?
Thank you, Councillor Duck. I'm going to look at my colleague Philippos. If you heard that question about just the EV stalls at Lot E, if they were included, I believe they were, but
I'm going to turn to staff, Ms. Cleary. Cleary.
Through to Councillor, or through to the chair, those are BC Hydro charging stations, so they're not owned by the town.
Thank you. All right, I'll now turn back to Councillor Garnett.
Thank you, Chair. I just have one more question. With reference to the potential for long-term overnight parking at the Mary Winspear, do you have any idea in terms of what hours that would be? Like in terms of like is it 8 a.m. to 6 a.m., 8 p.m. to like what hours, and just for context?
Through the chair to Councillor Garnett. No, we did not want to get into that level of detail. It's something that if the town does want to pursue that, they can look into looking at the hours that be in effect, but it was not part of our study.
Thank you.
I'll turn to Councillor O'Keefe.
Thank you. Just one more. When the mayor was talking about forecasting, and I was similar question in regards to other like peak times for events. So Sydney has lots of events throughout the year, and I'm just wondering whether any thought was given or in terms of how those additional events impact parking, obviously, and any strategies or things we might do in order to deal with that. Like when I look at the data from the PED counters, it's common for the traffic to more than double or triple in some cases what is sort of normal traffic. So any thought given to that sort of those events?
Through the chair to Councillor O'Keefe, I'll take a first shot at answering that, and then my colleague Philippos Kakis may have additional insights. But in general, like in a downtown parking study or parking strategy, the recommendations that we come up with for parking management do want to speak to sort of day-to-day conditions. And I know, yes, we counted in August and October, but in general, the parking management tools we come up with should allow the town to manage parking on a day-to-day basis, i.e. not the peak. Because if you are planning around the peak, just like, for example, a shopping center, if you provide, with a shopping center, as an example, the parking's provided to accommodate parking the week before Christmas, which is the busiest time of the year. And then the rest of the year, that parking lot is empty or half full or what have you. So it's less efficient for that point of view, but that's how shopping malls are designed, to accommodate that peak demand. If you were to do that in a downtown, you'd have a lot of parking that would likely be underutilized, and the value of land in a downtown is pretty high, and one could argue if you need to provide all that parking. But to answer the second part of your question about events, there's a whole bunch of different tools out there that communities do or use, especially ones that have a lot of tourism, about sort of event planning. There's wayfinding, there's additional signage. Sometimes there's ambassadors that are hired by a community to have parking ambassadors who can help direct tourists to where the parking lots are, for example, like the dedicated long-term parking lot. So there's a whole bunch of different tools that are used by communities, by municipalities to manage parking around events. It just depends on what's most suitable for Sydney. I'm not sure if my colleague Philippos has anything to add to that.
Nothing to add to that.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I'll return to Mayor McNeil-Smith.
Thank you, Chair. One question I had, and I searched the internet and I can't, when I was speaking, or while others were speaking, is I visited a community in the Puget Sound, a small community, similar size to Sydney, on the other side of from Seattle, and they had similar challenges. I spoke with several business owners there, and they had similar challenges to Sydney in terms of employee parking. And they actually put in, the parkade was dedicated to employee use, and employers were actually paying the parking fees, which were, I don't know, at the day considered fairly significant. In your experience, do you know of communities that have had parkades dedicated to commercial zones, dedicated to commercial or to employee parking?
Through the chair to the mayor, no, I don't. I think in more of my experience, parkades are serving a variety of users, including short-term parking users, but also employees who require long-term parking. But I don't have an example I can point to that where a parkade's been specifically constructed to serve employee needs.
Thank you.
I'll turn to Councillor Novak.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through chair to Mr. Shaw. I'm a numbers guy. much like yourself, and I'm sure that a big chunk of your business is crunching numbers and using these to make a point, or not to make a point, as the case may be. And I'm looking at a couple of highlights or items from your presentation specifically. One of them was about the intercept survey. And the comments from the intercept survey, and I didn't write them all down, but they're there and we can look them up when we have time. But the suggestion to me is that from the intercept survey, and so those, just to remind people, these were people that you met on the street, that you interviewed in a more or less random manner. And the suggestion from that survey is that we don't really have a parking problem. And then again, later on in your presentation, towards the end, you talked about the key takeaways from this whole process. And again, you listed 2 or 3 points, the suggestion of which was that we don't really need to do very much to deal with our parking problem, quote unquote, or lack of problem, as the case may be. And I would suggest it's the latter. My question is, knowing this and then having looked at all this data, and I'm going to ask you a very blunt and pointed question. Would you say, as an expert in the field, that we have a parking problem that needs to be fixed? Excuse my tone.
through the chair to Councillor Novak. I don't want to be too definitive in my statement, apart from what's in my presentation and the parking study, but I do want to just say that the study that we conducted, based on those 4 counts, concluded, and this is why I brought up this slide deliberately, that the parking conditions are underutilized to well utilized. It depends on the block and the location, which suggests that there is not a parking problem. So I'll underscore which suggests that there's not a parking problem based on the data that we collected. But a big part of the study, we want to make sure, just to add as much value to the town as possible and to help town staff, is saying that even if the parking conditions on average are underutilized or to well utilized, there are still things the town can do to improve the parking experience for people, whether it's the everyday resident who's driving downtown or visitors, because improving the parking experience is also important. And in addition to that, there are things the town can do to also encourage some people to not drive and use transit and bike and walk for those who are able to do so, in line with the OCP and in line with the draft active transportation plan, for example. So I hope that answers your question, maybe not in a direct way, but just to underscore that we stand by the data and that the parking conditions are not overutilized and there aren't that many issues, but there are ways that there are different tools the town could use to improve parking management practices, which can thereby improve the parking experience for downtown parkers.
So you say we might be able to tweak our parking experience with these recommendations, bring it from here to here, but overall, we don't have a problem that needs fixing.
Through the chair, just trying to be as diplomatic in my answer as possible. I think there's, and this is why we had recommendations on accessible parking, for example, recognizing that there are still some people who will require parking spaces, and right now they're not getting the best experience possible because the design standards are subpar. So there are ways to improve that experience for them. And the town can directly do that through tools. So I just want to be clear that I think, I don't want to directly answer the parking problem part of your question, but I think the data show that the parking conditions are underutilized, but there's still things that the town could do to improve parking. So.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shaw. I appreciate your response.
Committee members, any further questions? Seeing none, I would like to thank you, Mr. Shaw, for your presentation and taking time to answer the questions from committee members. And thank you again.
Thank you very much, Council.
Councillor Novak?
Mr. Chair, I'd like to move that this presentation be received for information.
Second to the motion?
Second.
Councillor Garnett? Any discussion to the motion? See none, all in favor? Thank you, council members. Motion passes unanimous. Thank you, Mr. Shaw. I would suggest a recess, 5-minute recess at this point, if that's okay with committee members. We'll reconvene at 8:15. Thank you. Committee members, I'd like to bring us back into session, please. 8:15. So moving on through the agenda, we have no development applications. And we're now move on to number 8, staff reports. And I'll turn to staff. The Director of Engineering, Ms. Clary, to present the report, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'll keep this brief. Overall, Watt Consulting did an excellent job on the parking study. Staff are very impressed with the work that they've done. I won't get into any of the details of the staff report because most of it was covered in the presentation, but we are recommending that staff proceed with some of the operational type recommendations from Watt's report. They're detailed in the staff report. And then we're recommending that a number of the more significant items that may be more impactful come back to a future committee of the whole for future discussion after committee has a bit of time to digest these recommendations. And I'm here to answer any questions if you have any.
Thank you, Ms. Clary. Any questions from the committee to staff? Seeing none, I'll entertain, oh, sorry, Councillor Mayor McGill-Smith.
Sorry, thank you, Chair. Sorry, I think I'll let us deal with the motions and then I may have a motion arising. So, thank you, Chair.
I'll turn to Councillor Rintoul for questions to the staff.
No, I'm ready to move the recommendation.
Oh, okay.
I'll move the recommendation that's,
Oh, I have a question. I'll turn to Councillor O'Keefe.
Thank you. Will we be getting any additional information from staff in terms of, I don't think it was in here, but did we, in terms of utilization of how many in our town lots, in terms of like how many monthly parkers and long-term parking there is? I remember we had some discussion of that with Mr. Hissick when we were talking about flipping the lots around. But is that something that would be useful for us to consider along with all of this?
Through to Councillor O'Keefe, I'll try to take a first stab at this, but if Mr. Hissick has additional information, he's more than welcome to step in. But there were some changes to the parking lot, the management of the parking lots and the costing of the monthly passes. I don't believe there's any plan to report back at this time, but Mr. Hissick is, I see he's here.
Mr. Hissick?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Staff's understanding was that we would follow up with that type of information following the parking study, so that it could potentially happen between now and the time that it's reconsidered by committee.
Yeah, okay, yeah, that was sort of my understanding as well. So if we move ahead to discuss this later, at a later date, that staff would bring forward that additional information at that time? Okay.
Depending on timing of when that is.
Right, okay. Yeah, it seems like it would make sense to look at it holistically. That's all, thank you.
Any other questions from committee members? I'll turn to Councillor Rintoul. I'm going to suggest that we split the recommendations into each of a motion, 1 and 2.
thank you. I'll move that staff proceed with the operational recommendations identified in the 2022 downtown parking study, with the exception of action 1A, remove markings for delineated stalls.
Second to the motion? Seconded by
Second for discussion.
Motion made by Councillor Rintoul, seconded by Mayor McGill-Smith. I'll turn to the mover.
Yeah, thank you. So I think these operational recommendations are, very much in keeping with that sort of low-hanging fruit that we can look to staff to get started on making these very reasonable improvements to parking. I'm going to read them out so that I think we're all on the same page, those who are perhaps listening at home, and that is, those include implementing consistent time restrictions, implementing 1-hour parking restrictions on busier blocks, increase targeted enforcement on high parking duration blocks, consolidate passenger pickup and drop-off zones, adopt on-street accessible parking design standards, increase supply of commercial loading and accessible parking stalls, retain the 3-hour restriction in off-street lots, and enhance parking wayfinding. The reason I don't support at this point removing the markings for delineated stalls is simply because I feel like it's probably one of the more contentious items in there that would require further discussion. I'd rather see it come back with the bulk of the significant recommendations for further discussion by council. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll turn to seconder, Mayor McNeil-Smith.
Thank you. I support the comments of the mover. I would like to move an amendment at this time, and that is to remove Action 1C, implement 1-hour parking restrictions on busier blocks. I'll motivate if I have a seconder.
Second to the amendment?
Second.
Second. I'll turn to the Mayor McNeil-Smith on the amendment.
Yeah, thank you. My reason for removing this is I would like to have some further discussion on this other than this evening, and that is in the 2016 study, Watt Consulting recommended 1-hour parking on not only these two stretches on 1st and 2nd, but also on 3rd, 4th, and 5th. And Council of the Day defeated the motion, defeated the recommendation. And I would just like to have a bit of discussion about the rationale for this beyond tonight's discussion.
I'll turn to the seconder.
I'll support this in an effort to ensure that we can move a motion this evening that allows for what I feel would be reasonable operational recommendations to be addressed in the near term. Thank you.
I'll turn to Councillor Garnett for discussion on the amendment.
On just specifically to what, that one amendment? Okay, well, I have something else to say.
Okay. Any other? Councillor Novak?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll support this motion because I believe we already have 1-hour parking on Beacon, and I think adding 1-hour parking, or rather taking away 2-hour parking from the side streets and other busy blocks will not make a significant difference to our parking availability. Based on the study that Watt provided to us, the parking density on the side streets is considerably lower than it is on Beacon, and so I'm not convinced that implementing that on streets other than Beacon, which already has it, would do anything to improve our parking situation. So I'm happy to remove this.
Further discussion of the amendment? Councillor, no? Okay, I will call the question on the amendment, which is to implement 1-hour parking as well as remove the markings, correct? That's the amendment, is to add that.
I beg your pardon, Chair. I think the amendment only relates to action item 1C.
Correct, correct, yeah. So, all in favor? Opposed? We have one opposed, Councillor O'Keefe. Motion passes for the amendment. We'll return to the main motion. Discussion on the main motion? Councillor Garnett?
This is getting intertwined, unfortunately, but I also have something that I wouldn't support the amendment, or I wouldn't support the original motion without something I would like to add as well, and that is I would like to pull items 1F and 1G out, and that is because I would like to hear from SPAC.
Councillor Garnett, can you
Yes.
make a motion to that effect?
I can do that. I would like to pull items 1F and 1G out for further discussion, actually to refer to SPAC for comment.
Do we have a second to that motion?
I'll second.
Second, Councillor Keefe. Councillor Garnett?
Yeah, I want to get it right, and I like what's suggested in here, and I like the advice going to standards, but at the same time, I'm an able-bodied person that doesn't use these spaces. I want to hear from our committee that we've formed, and I think this is part of their purpose. And if there's something in there that doesn't work as users of these spaces, I would like to know now before we make changes. And I'd like to hear from them in terms of the fact of whether it functions in the way we're intending.
I'll turn to the seconder, Councillor O'Keefe.
Councillor Garnett articulated that well, and I think what we heard from the consultant is that there is no standards or a lot of best practices out there in terms of what is the appropriate number, what's the best way of configuring them. So it seems to me if there is no really good standard, to talk to the people that use it. Now, having said that, I'm in support of this going to SPAC, but I'm actually opposed to the motion overall to proceed with these things until we have, I think it should also go.
Councillor O'Keefe, I'm going to interject. We're speaking to the amended motion, not to the overall motion. So you're speaking to the amendment to remove action
Okay.
1F and 1G.
Okay, we'll just leave it at that for now then.
Thank you. Any other further discussion? Councillor, our Mayor McNeil-Smith?
Thank you, Chair. Question through you to staff with regards to the accessible. We heard from the consultant and then a comment from staff with regards to best practices or guidelines. And I guess there's two aspects. One is design and one is locations. I believe there would be actually information on design guidelines that staff would implement for accessible and commercial loading spaces.
Through to the mayor. Again, as Mr. Shaw indicated, this is something that isn't commonly done, so it would be something we'd have to, with accessible parking next to a loading parking, I would, from staff's perspective, it would make more sense to kind of pilot it to see how it works together, and if there ends up being conflict, not doing it in other places. But if it works well, because both users need a ramp, then we could implement it in other places. But it's not currently being done widely, is our understanding from speaking with Watt about this particular item.
Thank you. Follow-up, Chair. Sorry, I didn't phrase my question well enough. I'm thinking of particularly the design standards for an accessible space.
Through to the mayor, Watt did provide design standards for the accessible space by itself. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Duncan?
Thank you. Now, just understanding the way Councillor Garnett has brought up this movement, this amendment, it sounds to me to take these out and then move them to the significant, set of significant recommendations that will be coming back to council to discuss later. But I'm not sure whether council needs to discuss these. If council would have further input, it sounds more like Councillor Garnett wants to pull them out simply to give time for SPAC to provide some feedback. But I don't know that SPAC needs to provide feedback to council so much as that SPAC might need to have the conversation with staff who would be implementing these design guidelines. And so I'm wondering whether they actually need to be pulled out of this, or if rather they should be moved forward with the rest of these things, and a different motion should be made rather to refer this to, an item on SPAC's agenda, so that they get a chance to look at it when staff is doing this item. Because I don't know what more council would be able to add to this that wouldn't, we don't need to approve whether the sign is good or not, because there's a design standard that's being supplied by Watt, and it's just a matter of whether our SPAC committee is going to say, oh, that's really consistent with maybe the rest of the peninsula, or, in Sydney this wouldn't work. And so I'm wondering whether there might be a better motion rather than moving it.
Councillor Keith?
So I guess part of this goes back to how the terms of reference and the governance is in place with SPAC. So the way I understand it is that council is the one that refers things to SPAC for their input. And then the way that it comes back is through council. And then at that point, council can say, then that's where council's role is to direct staff to. We can either receive the information from SPAC for information, or we can direct staff to follow up on the recommendations provided by SPAC. So yeah, that's how I understand it. The other thing in terms of the question about, is there a design that's out there? And staff has said yes. So what we've started to learn now that we've got SPAC is that there's often designs and they don't get implemented accurately because of lack of understanding. So we've got a number of examples around that in the town where there's a standard for what the lines are supposed to look like at certain intersections for people who are blind. And so the lines are there, but they're not aligned appropriately. So sometimes there's a bit of a disconnect between what is in the design and then what actually comes out in practice. And so that's why I think it's useful to get their input up front rather than running a pilot and find out, if we had just talked to them, they would have said, no, that's not going to work, or that's going to be problematic because et cetera. So that's why I think it's important to pull those things out and to make sure that they get the opportunity to comment them back to council.
Mayor McNeil Smith?
Thank you. So on the floor, we have a motion to, an amendment motion to remove these two. And I think in making a in casting my vote on this, what I need to appreciate is what would be a reasonable process on how these would be handled if we do remove them. So my question through you to staff is, we've been reminded that the terms of reference for the committee is for council to refer an item to the committee, and that any comments or recommendations from the committee come back to council. I think I would prefer, subject to hearing from staff, that I would prefer staff to go ahead and do the necessary work that they feel they need to do in terms of designing the accessible parking spaces, in terms of designing the commercial loading spaces, and the locations, and if they're going to go together, and then that be referred to the committee, rather than the committee starting to weigh in with ideas or comments about what the staff might do. So I might turn to staff on process in terms of if we remove these as with the motion on the floor, is it reasonable for council to have a motion arising after the main motion is dealt with, requesting staff proceed with design, and council is comfortable with those going directly to the committee, and then the committee could submit them to council, not that council is going to weigh in on them, but would refer them back to staff.
Thank you, through Councillor Duck to Mayor McNeil Smith. Yeah, staff would concur with that sentiment, that approach. Quite frankly, it would keep the item moving forward. It would remain operational. Staff could advance it, and through the direction of council, we would forward it on then to SPAC when we reach that the level of design detail that would be appropriate, and then look to have SPAC provide comments on the work done by staff to council, and council could review that, and it could go through the process that way. So, yeah, we think that would be a reasonable approach, certainly.
Ms. Cleary?
Thank you. Through to the committee. I do also want to clarify that these are two different items. So the adopt an on-street parking or accessible parking design standards, that is something that is relatively easy to do. There's lots of available standards that the town can follow. The more unknown is having on-street accessible parking spots beside on-street loading zones. So the action 1F should be very straightforward. We can look at other communities. We can provide the standard that we're hoping to use to SPAC, and then get feedback from them. The questionable one, or the one that might need a little bit more research, is the commercial loading zones beside the accessible parking spaces.
Thank you. Councillor O'Toole?
Thank you. Yeah, I won't support the amendment that's before us. I do like the prospect of seeing a notice of motion come to refer, particularly 1G as was, or excuse me, 1F and 1G to SPAC as they come back to us. Look, we've got an engineering staff to pull this together. This is not the group to wordsmith, this, but getting that input through a notice of motion to SPAC, I think, would be most appropriate. Thank you.
Any further discussion to the amendment, which is to remove action 1F and 1G? See none, I will call, Councillor O'Keefe?
Yeah, I'll just end with saying, part of the terms of reference and what we're trying to do with SPAC is the calling card of the community is nothing about us without us. And so it's a concern for me that we're not being more proactive in saying, here's what we're thinking of doing, and we have to do this. Give us some ideas before we get to the design phase, rather than try to fix it later. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Councillor Novak?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not sure why we want to take these out. It's obvious that we want to proceed with these standards, and as our staff has informed us, that adopting 1F is not a big deal because these standards exist out there in the world, and it's simply a question of choosing a standard. 1G, okay, that requires a little bit of work, but I think if we approve the motion with these items in it, then the next step is for staff to come back with these design criteria. I'm not sure that we benefit by tearing this all apart, and I just won't vote for it at this point.
Mayor McNeil-Smith?
Thank you. Just to reiterate, the reason for removing is procedurally, the advisory group terms of reference are for council to refer the items. While it may sound practical that we could just go ahead and leave them here and have them operational and have staff go and consult with the advisory group, that's not how our procedures are set up. And you know, municipal procedures are set up for transparency, and the procedure for an advisory group with citizen representatives is for council to make the referral. So that's the reason. It's not that council wants to meddle in the design of these spaces. It's that we want input from the advisory committee. Chair?
Councilor Rintoul?
Yes, sorry, that position confuses me because what I heard from staff was, yeah, let's let them get started on this. Let's let them do some of this background work, and a notice to motion would come to refer this to SPAC. So yeah, they'd report back to council. It would be a motion from council. No one's talking about bypassing SPAC. We're talking about going to them once we have some firm direction to get their comment. Would this work? Why wouldn't this work? You know, help us with this design and make it work. So what we're trying to accomplish here is being able to move forward with some operational recommendations to give our engineering staff the latitude to get a start on this, and then refer, once we've got something more concrete, to SPAC to have a detailed discussion and report back to council. So I continue to state that I won't support the amendment before us. Thank you.
Councilor Novak?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would support an amendment to send these items to SPAC after staff has commenced.
Point of order, Chair.
See, yep.
The recommendation, when I motivated to this, is that if these were removed, council would make a motion arising to refer these to staff for design and referral to the Accessibility Advisory Committee.
Point of order noted. Councilor Duncan?
No.
I'm not finished.
Well, the reason I made the point of order, Chair, is because I've indicated a process, and
Yeah.
I think it's being misinterpreted.
So you spoke on that. He responded to point of order, so you can come back to speak again, but on that one, I move to the next speaker.
Yeah, on that point.
Yeah. Councilor Duncan?
Thank you. I think the mayor clarified, because I was hear what Councilor Rintoul was saying, that it actually sounds like council's really all on the same page, and it's just a matter of figuring out whether we need to remove it in order to move the process along to the next motion, or whether we didn't. And it sounds to me the mayor has clarified to me adequately that the proper process to make sure that these do get referred and then come back to council with the process that Councilor O'Keefe is suggesting, which is that staff can move ahead on these designs tonight if we have a subsequent motion. But if we moved these, if we did not remove these, if the motion fails and we don't remove these and they begin working on it without a subsequent motion, they would not be coming back to council anyway. And so process-wise, we must remove them in order to make that subsequent motion? Okay, thank you.
Further discussion? Councilor Novak?
Mr. Chair, I don't see that. I think we can still make that motion after the first motion passes to refer those two items to SPAC once staff has come up with pro forma designs. I don't think that it's necessary to remove this from the bulk of these actions.
Mayor McNeil Smith.
Okay. I may have missed a point being made by two colleagues, and that is if we do not remove these, staff can proceed with the design. To follow proper procedure for referral to the committee, they would have to come back to council for us to refer them to committee, so to the advisory committee. So we can give direction to staff to design and take them to the referral committee tonight, or we can leave these in and staff are gonna bring them back to us to refer to the committee. To me, it's easier to remove them tonight and make the motion for staff to proceed and go to the committee without it having to come back to council.
Councillor O'Keefe.
Thank you. And the other advantage to doing, as Mayor McNeil Smith has said, is that SPAC only meets every 2 months. And so if we give staff this direction tonight, then at whatever point they get their designs together, they already have the direction from council. And they can go to a SPAC meeting, whenever that might be, rather than waiting to bring that back to council and then have council give direction at that time. So Mayor McNeil Smith makes more sense.
Councillor Novak.
I'm seeing it as 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, but I'm okay with supporting Mayor McNeil Smith's motion as long as it does get to staff eventually. The design does get to SPAC. I'm not sure if really this is a case of process or just a case of wordsmithing.
Any further discussion to the amendment? This is on the amendment to remove item actions 1F and 1G. Any further discussion? See none, I'll call the question. All in favor of removing these? Opposed? We have one opposed. Councillor Rintoul. The motion passes. We move back to the main motion. Councillor McNeil Smith, or Mayor McNeil Smith.
Thank you. On the main motion. So I will make a motion arising after this main motion is dealt with regards to those two recommendations just removed. But my question is, through to staff is, if I understand the report correctly with regards to the loading zone and accessibility, or sorry, the loading spaces and the accessibility spaces, that they're recommended, and I appreciate staff will give further consideration and go forward with something, but recommended to be in the middle of the block, between 5th and 4th, between
Mayor
4th.
McNeil Smith, I'm going to call point of order. We're discussing the motion, and that item has been removed from the motion.
Sorry, my apologies. I meant to leave it till
So,
afterwards.
Back to the main motion, and the main motion now, just for clarity, as presented by Councillor Rintoul, the main motion has removed actions 1A, 1C, 1F, and 1G.
It's actually that items 1A, 1C be removed, and that items 1F and 1G be removed from the recommendation and referred to SPAC for comment.
No, at this point, the motion made, or the amendment made, was to remove them, not for any further action. That further action will come once this motion is done. So, discussion to the main motion?
Just a point of order, part of clarification, it's the main motion as amended.
Correct.
Thank you.
Sorry, the original motion did not include 1A?
Correct.
So we haven't made an amendment to remove 1A. The original
Yes.
the original motion did not include 1A.
The original motion was made, and then there was an amendment removing 1A and 1C, and yes, there was, and then a follow-up.
If you want to turn to the mover, Chair.
When I moved it, I did not include 1A in the original motion.
Which?
1C was removed, 1A
So
was
what?
not
Okay.
included.
Sorry, that's my error.
So 1C, 1F, and 1G.
Okay. So thank you for that clarification. So we now stand with the main motion removing 1C, 1F, and 1G. Mayor McNeil Smith.
Sorry, the question I meant to ask the last time is, through you, Chair, to staff, is can staff give an indication on the aspects that are in this motion, what the timeline might be for implementation?
Through to Mayor McNeil Smith, each item, it's dependent. Some items will be more expensive. We'll have to come back for budget for next year, in particular, to make any amendments to curb to add curb ramps for accessible parking. That will likely have to be a budget item next year. So this year would really be the planning year for those projects. So they vary. There is an implementation strategy in the back of Watt's study, but staff can provide more information on more specific timing if that's something that council's interested in.
Thank you, through the chair. That would be helpful. I think these are tangible improvements in the downtown commercial zone, and I will leave it with staff, given the comment that we've made with regards to hearing back on implementation timelines.
Any further? Councillor Keith?
Thank you.
Sorry, at a time of staff's choosing.
So I think these are good things. My only question is to my colleagues, and maybe colleagues that have businesses on Beacon Avenue, in terms of, are there things here that you think the business community downtown would want to have some input on before we move forward with them? Or based on what we know about the business community, do you think they would say, yeah, these are all good things, move ahead? Or whether it might be a good idea to check in with them to get input?
Councillor O'Toole?
I don't know if you're permitting discussion on that, so I'll yield to your preference, but I have some comments certainly.
Well, it's discussion to the motion, so at this point, Councillor Keefe is suggesting that the items that remain in there, should they be put out for further discussion, and if there's no entertainment of that, then we'll move to vote on the motion.
I wouldn't entertain that, given the nature of these operational recommendations. So enhanced parking wayfinding. Yeah, businesses are gonna be happy about that. Retaining 3-hour restrictions off-street lots. I mean, there's no change there. I think if the business community wanted, had concerns with that, they would have been here this evening and addressed it, but it's status quo, so I'm not gonna go through them all.
Okay.
But I'm gonna suggest that, operationally, as these come forward, there's obviously gonna be continued opportunity. I think what the business community is going to want to comment on are these significant recommendations, like the community did this evening. For example, paid parking and a pilot of that nature. That's not being discussed tonight. That's not being supported at this time. It's in a draft, report to us, and so, yeah, let's let engineering staff, get on with making these changes to make parking better. Thank you.
Any further discussion to the motion? Any need for clarification on the motion? Councillor Novak?
Yeah, I'd just like to make sure that action 1A is still in and part of the motion, because at some point in time, somebody wanted to take it out.
Correct, no, it's not. So if I can, and then staff, if you can make sure I'm correct, but the motion is that staff proceed with the operational recommendations identified in the 2022 downtown parking study, which now include 1A, 1B, 1D, 1E, 2A, and 2D.
No.
Oh.
1A is not included. So 1A was removed at the time of the original motion prior to
That's
the
what I
amendments.
thought, yeah.
Well,
So what's included in
so we
here
haven't included that.
right now, what is included, 1B, 1D, 1E, 2A, and 2D.
Thank you.
Okay.
Councillor Novak?
So I would like to speak to that, since we're on that motion, I think. I'm not happy with the removal of 1A.
Point of order, we'll have to have a motion arising with regards to 1A.
I thought we're still on that motion.
No.
No,
The
so,
motion that we are on now does not include 1A.
correct. So you can, a motion arising, you can bring it back after we vote on this motion, but it's been removed from this motion.
Sorry, procedurally given that 1A was not in the original motion put forward, you could make a motion to amend it to add it. My suggestion is given the motion, and we've had it clarified that's on the floor, is deal with this motion, and if we want to come back to 1A as a motion arising, that we do it then.
Fair. Yes. Does that clarify it for you, Councillor Novak? Any further discussion on the motion? Okay, I will call for a vote on the motion as amended. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you very much. We'll now move to the second motion.
Sorry,
Mr.
Chair, if I might have
Oh.
a motion arising with regards to 1F and 1G.
Yep.
That those proceed to staff for implementation, and that staff take them directly to the Accessibility Advisory Committee for comment and recommendation.
Second to the motion.
Second.
Second by Councillor Garnett. Discussion to the motion? Seeing no discussion, I'll call for a vote on the motion as presented. All in favor? Opposed? None opposed. The motion carries.
Mr. Chair,
No.
another motion arising.
Go ahead.
So I would like to move that action 1A be reinserted in the operational recommendations.
Second to the motion? Seeing no second, there's no motion presented to the table. We'll now move to the recommendation number 2.
Thank you. I'll move that the significant recommendations as well as 1A from the operational recommendations from the 2022 downtown parking study be brought back to a future committee of the whole meeting for further discussion.
Second to the motion?
I'll second.
Second by Mayor McNeil Smith. I'll turn to the mover for
Yep.
nothing. Seconder?
Thank you. I appreciate that staff have in the report broken out what they what are operational and council has or committee has made a recommendation on those. And then staff have brought forward, indicated what they consider to be significant recommendations. There's a total of 23 recommendations in the report, and they don't all add up. I know there is some reference to other recommendations elsewhere, but to be honest, I haven't had a chance to review. So some of the 23 recommendations are not being motioned at all. I don't know if staff wishes to speak to that, but I'm going to leave the motion as it is on the floor because I can't speak to whether those ones that we aren't addressed in the staff report.
Through to staff, Ms. Clary.
Sure, I can clarify that. There are a number of recommendations that are dependent on other projects, such as the active transportation project or like improvements to transit and things like that, that are not really directly, although they will impact the overall parking situation in Sydney, they're not directly related to things that can be implemented to do that. So they're related to other projects.
Thank you. Councillor Garnett.
Thank you, Chair. Just for clarification, were we not wanting to include 1C at this portion as well? I thought you had wanted that to be for future discussion, Mayor.
Sorry, I did. Yes, I did.
I consider that a friendly amendment if the seconder's happy with that, if the chair's okay.
Okay, we have a friendly amendment and the seconder agrees. Any discussion? Vote on the amendment. All in favor? None opposed. The motion amendment passes. Any further discussion on the current motion? Mayor McNeil Smith.
The question to staff, based on my previous question and the response from staff, I appreciate that response, but there is a action 2C, for example, is install real-time parking information displays. Given that that's not included in either of our motions, when would that come back for consideration?
Ms. Clary?
Through to Mayor McNeil Smith, that is a long-term recommendation in the staff report. So there are a couple of those that we expect won't be implemented before the next parking study in 5 years. And so when that next parking study comes back, that can be considered. If council or committee would like to see those come in sooner, you can bring them into the future discussion if that is a desire.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any further discussion? Okay, I will call a vote on the motion. All in favor? Opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Thank you. Any other further discussion or motions arising? Councillor O'Keefe?
I'll make a motion that the 2022 downtown parking study be referred to the SBIA and the Chamber for their review and comment.
Second to the motion? See no seconder, the motion does not continue forward.
Okay.
Any other further discussion? I will seek a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
We are adjourned. Thank you.